الحمد لله نحمده ونستعينه ونستغفره ونتوب إليه ونعوذ بالله من شرور أنفسنا ومن سيئات أعمالنا. من يهده الله فلا مضل له ومن يضلل فلا هادي له، وأشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له، وأشهد أن محمدا عبده ورسوله صلى الله عليه وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم. وبعد. As we all know, the topic for today and tomorrow is the Islamic world. Where is it heading? And before I start in the topic, get into the topic in detail, I'd like to bring to mind certain matters that people often err in concerning this issue. One of the prevalent characteristics that you find amongst Muslims when they are discussing what is going around them, the affairs of the world and the role that Muslims play in these affairs, is that often they proceed from emotionalism. Often their reaction to events are emotional reactions. Often their understanding and their conceptual ideas are based upon emotional reactions. And hence, the discussion and their treating of this topic is, if not erroneous, it is incomplete. And such emotionalism and such extremism which sprouts from this emotionalism results in another group of Muslims taking the opposite direction, that of denial. So one extremism is faced with another extremism. And hence you find a group of Muslims who wish to be like the ostrich, who had said that when the ostrich is afraid, will stick its head in the ground, hoping that the animal will not see it and therefore pass it by and not kill it. So one group of Muslims are extreme and out of emotionalism speak without knowledge, without correct analysis of the affairs and the events that are around them, and therefore this results in another group of Muslims who are in a state of denial, who wish not to face up to the realities of what is going around them, in the hope that it just might pass them by. Now, the world today is not like the world of 50 years ago or 25 years ago. And it's not like the world of 100 years ago. I'm sure, especially in a country like the United Kingdom, with my little knowledge of the ideas current in the Islamic field in the United Kingdom, I'm sure many of you probably have heard at one time or another discussions of the Uthmani Khilafah and discussions on how it fell and how this was the last Khalifa of the Muslims. So, I don't want to get into that discussion right now. Perhaps in the question and answer session we might address some of these issues, but the point that I would like to say is that when the Uthmani Khilafah fell at the first part of this century, the world that those Muslims lived in, the world of our grandparents, for those people who are of my age, in the 30s and so forth, or those people who are even older than me, maybe of their parents, is a completely different world that we live in today. The world today has become like a single village, as they say. Although there are still Muslims who still view their village as the whole world. What does that mean? The world is so interconnected. Ideas feed through the world, through the massive different communications, that the effect and influence of an event or an issue that occurs in one part of the world is felt immediately in another part of the world. And we sense this. And as a result, the ramifications of this upon the Muslims are great indeed. We are no longer in our castles between us and the unbelievers, thousands of miles, and we can sort of just bottle ourselves up and not worry about them until we face them on the battlefield. The unbeliever now is able to penetrate each and every home of the Muslims through the means of communication, through television, through radio, through computer networks, whatever the modes of communication that people use. And as a result, every single Muslim is under attack. Maybe not a physical attack. Nobody maybe is jumping on you and trying to beat you or kill you. But your mind is under attack. The beliefs of yours are under attack. Your identity, your sense of being is under attack. And it's not an attack which comes and goes. You know, boxers, I'm sure every one of you have seen a boxing match at one time in your life. Boxers come, they hit gloves, they fight for 2 minutes, and then the bell rings, and it stops. And they sit down, take a breather. The attack ends. This type of attack is unrelentless. There's no time to sit down in your corner, take your breath, and then prepare yourself for the next round. And this attack which we face, an attack which is at different levels, aims not only at conquering us in the terms of the physical resources of the Muslim lands, that they can use it and exploit it, because they already do, okay? Nor does it aim at the physical conquest of the land per se, because when they have to, they can conquer a land. Their armies are more powerful than the Muslim armies. But what it aims at is annihilating Islam from existence on the face of the earth. It is not a battle of warfare for a certain strip of land. It is not a battle, for instance, that we might witness, or if we were to just take a very limited look, like in Bosnia or Kashmir. You know, in a very limited sense, the Battle of Bosnia was a battle between Serbs and Muslim Bosnians. The battle at Kashmir, in a very limited outlook at the issue, or limited investigation, would be a battle between two people over certain mountains and a certain political control. This is not the type of battle that we are facing. The battle that we are facing these days is a battle which seeks to wipe out the existence of Islam on the earth. And so therefore, this attack is not only done by a group of people that we can say, okay, it's 5 people who are fighting us in a certain country, 10 people, a certain nation, but it's a global movement to wipe out Islam. And this global movement has unlimited financial resources and unlimited material resources. And the believers are in the state we know the believers are in. From their ignorance of their religion, from their ignorance of the laws of Allah's sunnah on the earth, in terms of why do nations rise and why do nations fall, and when does victory come and when does victory lost. There are certain natural laws that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has placed that all human beings take part in, whether believers or unbelievers. Ignorance of the law of Allah, ignorance of the natural laws of Allah, and ignorance of what is being plotted against us. And yet, with all their efforts and with all their machinations and plots, victory in the end will be for this ummah. But that does not mean necessarily that we will be the victors, myself and all you here. We might be the losers. We might lose our identity in this battle and fall off the wayside and lose our Islam. And so therefore it is important that a person at least has some idea regarding what is going on, because it no longer is an issue where these events occur in some remote corner of the earth and doesn't come and affect you. It will come and affect you in your own home, whether you like it or not, whether you want to face it or not. The ostrich cannot live in this age. The ostrich will die. And therefore it becomes among the priorities of da'wah unto Allah. Not the only priority, but among the priorities. So let us not misunderstand what I'm saying. It becomes among the priorities of da'wah unto Allah to break this attack with all the means we can have. Whether that occurs by writing, whether that occurs by speech, whether that occurs by actually physical warfare, like it occurs in certain lands where the Muslims are engaging the unbelievers, and their existence is in question if they were not to repel those attacks. Now, with that introduction, I was at a loss as to what to discuss before coming to the United Kingdom in this 4 lectures about the Islamic world. Where is it heading? In the sense that there are so many issues that we can discuss, I really did not know where to begin. And knowing how some of the ideas that many of the youth have, in general and in the United Kingdom in particular, where you find both extremes, those extremes of those people who talk about these issues out of emotionalism and without any knowledge of Allah's book or the Sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ, or even really current affairs, and the other extreme of denial. It also was confusing to me as to what should I specifically discuss. But as I said, events come and affect us, and events occurred during the last week or so that many of you, I should assume, would be aware of, and that is that when the Muslim brothers in Palestine blew up the Israeli buses and so forth, as a result there was a world reaction. And some 30 or 40 or 50 heads of state and about 20 Muslim heads of state, especially the Arab states, met in something which was called the Summit of Peacemakers. This event is not an event which can be just thought of, oh, well, it was just one meeting among their meetings. But in reality, it was a declaration of war against Islam. A declaration of war against this ummah. Where those of us who claim to be Muslims willingly put their hands with no shame and said, we will, with the Americans, the Europeans, and the Jews, do our utmost to wipe out Islam. The issue is cast in the terms of terrorism, and a Muslim is against terrorism. It is forbidden in our religion to kill the innocent. Even in jihad, I mean, even now in a situation where Muslims were attacked and were not the ones who began the aggression, but were aggressed upon, like in Bosnia, for instance. It was forbidden for the Muslims of Bosnia to kill Serbian children. It is forbidden for the Muslims of Bosnia to kill non-Serbian combatants, because this is the religion of Allah. So even though they cast the issue in one of terrorism, Muslims are against terrorism, without doubt. But this is a bogus issue. This is a covering up of the true facts of what they intend. And the issue is not Palestine, even though the discussion was concerning Palestine. The issue is the ummah as a whole. They might start with the Palestinian brothers, and they might work to root out Hamas at first. But I guarantee you, when they finish with them, they're coming for the rest. And when they come to root out the Muslims, they do not make a fine distinction that you like to make for yourselves. That he's, from the Ikhwan Muslimin, we'll take care of him, but you're a Salafi, we'll leave you alone. No. When they put the Muslim to the sword, they could care less who you are. Tablighi, Ikhwani, Salafi, Tahriri, Jihadi, it's all the same to them. Because it is the forces of unbelief attacking the ummah of Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, without exception. So They could care less. When they were killing Muslims in Afghanistan, the Russians, did the Russians, before shooting a Muslim, make a distinction? Saying he was from Ahl al-Hadith, or he was from the Ikhwan, or he was a Sufi? No. He was a Muslim. He's to be killed, irrespective of what is his identity. Now, don't misunderstand me to say that therefore these distinctions are of no importance and we should all just forget these distinctions and so forth. No, we have to know the truth in these matters. We have to know that Sufism is not Islam. We have to know that, for instance, Shiism is not Islam. And we have to know that those groups who claim to follow the Sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ but deviate in certain matters, we have to say you've deviated in these matters. But at the same time, this distinction that we have in our mind should not lead us to another extreme where we think that the battle is only between them, these groups, and the unbelievers. And us who claim themselves to be the pure followers of Ahl Sunnah wal Jama'ah, and Allah knows how true that claim is, we are free from the issue. And we can just sort of sit on the sidelines, sit on our couches at home, watch the battle go until both sides are sort of decimated, and then we'll just sort of come up and take over the world. That's ridiculous type of thinking. So this issue is what I'd like to talk about today. I'd like to talk about the issue of the peace process, the intellectual roots for it, how this issue ties up with our aqidah, what the ummah is responsible to do in order to face this issue, because Muslims need to know these matters. Why? In every single masjid now, at least in the United States, there is a call for interfaith. There is a call that since the Muslims in the Middle East are making peace, Jews and Christians and Muslims should now come together around the round table, forget their differences, and work for humanity. Benefit. And I imagine it's probably the same thing is existing today in London and in Birmingham and other cities. And I know for a fact it does exist in certain quarters. This is a ramification of the peace process. A direct link between what is going on in a political event, even though thousands of miles away from us, has a direct link on what is going on in our masajid in the United States and in Europe. Because as I said, this is a global movement to fight Islam. This is not just singular events. In our eyes, in our minds, we might perceive it as just singular events, but it is a global interlinked movement. Now, so let us now take on, for this, I guess we have an hour in this session, and then a second session thereafter, huh? Yeah, a little bit more. And then we can discuss this issue, and then of course tomorrow we'll have some other topics to discuss. And by no means we should imagine that I'm going to be able to discuss every single aspect of where the Islamic world is heading. I doubt there's anybody in the world who knows, no matter how great a scholar he is, knows all what is going on in the Islamic world. And also, we should understand that what I'm going to be presenting is not my ideas that I'm conveying to you, but really, all it is what scholars have written in Arabic, many different scholars, that I have sort of just put together for these lectures. Okay. Now, we all witnessed, I guess, over the last 3 or 4 years, what has happened in the peace process. We saw that after the Gulf War, George Bush announced his New World Order, and that the world was now going to come to a new type of system, something that the world had not seen before, where peace would be the call of the day, and hostility between nations would come to an end. And that they would start this and show this where the conflict began, in the Middle East. And he called for a just peace and a just settlement in his report to Congress after the Gulf War, in the State of the Union address, where there would happen, and he called for this, and then a few months later, we had the Madrid peace talks, and then afterwards we all saw the Gaza-Jericho agreement between the Palestinians and the Israelis, and then afterwards the peace between King Hussein of Jordan and the Israelis, and also the normalizations of relations between different Muslim countries to varying degrees and the Israelis. But where did this issue begin? Did the issue of Palestine begin in 1948 when the State of Israel was created, and so therefore we can solve the issue by meeting at the peace talks? When did this issue begin? This issue began about 4,000, 5,000 years ago. And it began with the Prophet Ibrahim alayhi salam. And that is, we all know that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala chose the Prophet Abraham alayhi salam and made him an imam, as Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in Surah Al-Baqarah, for all of humanity. And gave the Prophet Abraham a promise that he would be an imam of humanity and his righteous descendants after him would be leaders for humanity. His righteous descendants. And so this promise passed through Abraham's two sons, the Prophet Isaac alayhi salam, and the eldest son, the Prophet Ismail alayhi salam. And then this covenant, this promise between Allah and the descendants of Abraham passed to the children of Israel. And when they denied their messengers and disbelieved, it finally came to the final prophet of humanity, who was from the children of Ismail alayhi salam, our Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wasallam. And so therefore, a conflict occurred between three religions as to who was the inheritor of the promise given, the covenant given to Abraham alayhi salam. The Jews claim that this is their promise. The Christians say that they are the ones who have inherited this promise. And the Muslims say that they have inherited this promise. And the conflict in the Middle East is based upon this issue in reality. Who has inherited the covenant of God, of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, sent to the Prophet Abraham? And this issue, this dispute, this argument will continue till the day of judgment, when it's resolved on the battlefield, as we'll see. In the final battle of humanity, when the Muslims will fight the Christians and then the Muslims will fight the Jews, who will be led by the Antichrist, the Masih ad-Dajjal. But let us understand how the Jews and Christians view this promise. And then let us understand how they have taken certain political decisions based upon this understanding. And then we'll discuss how the Muslims believe, and some discussion of some of the signs of the hour, and how we must face what is going on now in regards to the peace process. What is our responsibility as Muslims? Because the discussion is not a theoretical talk. We're not here just to discuss ideas and historical facts and beliefs. We are also required to have action which proceeds from these beliefs. So in the end, we'll discuss some of those matters. Now the Jews based their interpretation of this promise, this covenant, based on a passage of Genesis, or a number of passages in Genesis. As you all know, the Bible is divided into two parts, or what the Christians refer to as testaments. There's the Old Testament and there's the New Testament. The Old Testament is what the Jews believe in, and it consists of the Torah, the 5 books which they attribute to the Prophet Moses alayhi salam. It consists of other books which they attribute to other prophets like Isaiah, like the Psalms of David. And the Jews, the first book of the Old Testament, or the Torah, is the book of Genesis. And in the book of Genesis, it starts off with saying how Adam was created, and they have their corruption of this, what occurred in the events. And then it comes to the issue of the descendants of Adam and the appearance of idolatry, and it comes to the issue of the Prophet Noah alayhi salam. And we all know that the Prophet Noah alayhi salam was mentioned in more than one passage in the Quran. Indeed, one whole surah of the Quran discusses the Prophet Noah alayhi salam, and I'm sure the major details of his life are known to the brothers here. But what do they think? They say that after Noah alayhi salam and the flood occurred, destroying humanity, Noah appeared on the earth with his descendants, And as it said in the corrupted text of the Torah, and Noah began to be a husbandman. A husbandman is an old English term, it's not used. It means basically what we would call like a shepherd. A person who is responsible for flock and cattle and so forth. So they're saying basically Noah became a farmer. And he planted a vineyard. And he drank the wine and was drunken. So here's an inscription to the Prophet Noah alayhi salam of drinking wine and becoming drunk. And he was uncovered within his tent. When Noah drank the wine, they say he became naked. So they perceived Allah's Prophet, the first messenger sent to the earth, as drunk, in a stupor, unclothed, in his tent. And this, of course, is one of the lies that they say against the prophets of Allah. And this is not the first nor the last lie that they make. And then they say that Ham, or Ham as they say in English, one of the three descendants of Noah, who was the father of Canaan, or Canaan in English, saw the nakedness of his father. One of the three sons of Noah, they say, entered into the tent and saw his father, Noah, alayhi salam, drunk and naked. This is what the Jews say. And told his two brethren without. And so he went out and he told his two brothers, the other two descendants of Noah, who were outside of the tent. And Shem and Japheth, two other sons of the Prophet Noah, took a garment and laid it upon their shoulders and went backward. In other words, they walked backwards. They put a garment on their shoulders and started to walk backwards into the tent. And their faces were backward, meaning that they were not looking at the direction of Noah, they were looking outside of the tent, walking backwards, as we say in English, modern English. And they saw not their father's nakedness, because they were walking backwards, they wouldn't see their father. And Noah awoke from his wine. I mean, after the effects of the booze came out, he became awake. And because he's a prophet, he knew what his younger son had done to him, which was that his son walked into the tent and saw his father naked. I mean, even though in any sort of court, in any sort of human gathering, we would realize that if somebody was to walk into a place and found somebody unknowingly there to be naked, it would be no sin of his whatsoever. But what happens to Noah's son? So then Noah says, and he said, "Cursed be Canaan. A servant of his servant shall he be unto his brethren." So he doesn't curse Ham, the son who saw him naked, but cursed Canaan, a son which has not even been born, his grandson, and says that Canaan shall be a servant of servants unto his brethren. And then he said, "Blessed be the Lord God of Shem." Lord, and he says, therefore he's saying that, Allah be blessed, who is the God of Shem, one of his sons. And Canaan shall be his servant, a second time. And God shall enlarge Japheth, who shall dwell he shall dwell in the tents of Shem, and Canaan shall be his servant. Okay. This passage from Genesis, these 7 verses from Genesis 9:20 through 27, is the basis of the belief of the Jews and the Christians. And that is, they believe that of the 3 sons of Noah, the son Ham, who was considered to be the father of the people of dark complexion, like the people of Africa, and Canaan, who was his son, were cursed into slavery, to serve Shem, who is considered to be the father of the Semitic people like the Jews. And Japheth, who are the Europeans according to their discussion of lineage, is to be living amongst Shem and therefore to receive some of the blessings. Now, when one thinks of this issue, let us imagine that Ham committed the worst sin on the earth. What was the sin of his son, Canaan, that he would be condemned to slavery 3 times in this passage to be a slavery to the Jews? And this is the idea that they have, that the people, or who they call the Canaanites, are to be slaves to them, the Semitic people, the Jews. This is the basis of their belief. And that is because Canaan is one of the forefathers of the Arabs before Ismail, alayhi salam. Even though Ismail is a descendant of Shem, but because of intermarriage and so forth, Canaan is one of the forefathers of Ismail. Now, in the United States, or in England, when you go to a Bible school, or like on Sunday when they go to Bible school, they will study this text, and they believe in it, especially the Protestants. And it's because of their belief in this issue that we find that the Christians and the Jews together. But let us continue with our study of Genesis. After that passage you find about Noah, you find another passage where the land of Canaan is described in a number of chapters in Genesis. For instance, in the 10th chapter of Genesis, we find that they said that the border of the Canaanites was from Sidon. Sidon is a city in Lebanon. As thou comest to Gerar, unto Gaza. So from Lebanon to Gaza, you know where Gaza is, the Gaza Strip, there on the Mediterranean Sea. As thou goest unto Sodom and Gomorrah, two cities which Allah destroyed, which are on the Jordan River, and Admah and Zeboim, and even unto Lasha. These are other areas in Palestine. So this is the borders of the lands of Canaan. Now we come to the covenant which the Jews say were given to the prophet Abraham. The Torah then reads, now the Lord said to Abram, the Jews believe and the Christians believe that Abraham's name was Abram, and then after he made hijrah, after he left from Iraq, where he was born, from Babylon to Palestine, his name was changed to Abraham. So the Lord said unto Abram, get thee out of thy country. In other words, make hijrah. And from thy kindred, leave your people. And from thy father's house. Unto a land I will show thee. And I will make thee, meaning you Abraham, a great nation. And I will bless thee. And make thy name great. And thou shalt be a blessing. And I will bless them that bless thee. And curse him that curses thee. And in thee shall all the families of the earth be blessed. So this is the promise that Allah gives to Abraham, that he will be blessed, and Allah will bless those who bless Abraham, and curse those who curse Abraham. And through Abraham, all the peoples of the earth will be blessed. Now, if you think of just that one passage, who does that passage apply to? What would you say? Any answers here in the audience? Huh? Muslims. Why? Because in every single salah, what do we say? Allahumma barak ala Muhammad kama barakta ala Ibrahim. Every single salah. And isn't it through the ummah of Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam that all the families of the earth have been blessed? In this audience we have right now in front of us, do we not see people from different families of the earth? I'm up here on the podium, I can see that. I see brothers who come from, looks like from the Middle East, from Arab lands. I see brothers from the Indian subcontinent. I see brothers whose origins are from Africa. If you might find in another Muslim gathering, you might find brothers from European origins. You might find brothers who come from Malaysia and China and so forth. So isn't it through this ummah that all the families of the earth have been blessed, have come to the peace? But of course they interpret it for themselves. But let us continue so we can understand how they think, how the Jews and Christians think. So they say that so Abraham departed. In other words, he made hijrah, he left Iraq, and he went to Palestine. This is something which the Muslims believe also. And as the Lord had spoken unto him, in other words, as Allah had ordered him. And Abraham passed through the land unto the place of Sichem, unto the plain of Morah, and the Canaanite was then in the land. In other words, this Canaan person who was cursed because his father saw his father, Noah, naked, the Canaanite was in the land. And the Lord appeared unto Abraham and said, unto thy seed I will give this land. In other words, the Canaanite who was living in the land, he will no longer have it, and unto the seed of Abraham, he has this land. So we have one thing, that the seed of Abraham is to have the land of Palestine. This is the first issue. Second issue, what do they say in the chapter 17 of Genesis? And I will establish my covenant between me and thee, meaning between Allah and Abraham, and thy seed, meaning your descendants, after thee, in their generations, it means generation after generation, for an everlasting covenant, to be a God unto thee, and to thy seed after thee. And I will give unto thee, and to thy seed after thee, the land wherein thou art a stranger, all the land of Canaan, for an everlasting possession. Okay. So it says that Allah made a covenant to be their God
for all time. We know that Abraham had two descendants, basically, the Ismail and his people, which are the Arabs, and Ishaq and his people, the children of Israel, the Jews. Nowadays, who is it that is the recipient of that covenant? It's the Muslims, because we are the ones who still worship Allah. And it's the Arabs who are the seed of the Prophet Abraham. So the land goes to them, because they're the ones who have fulfilled the covenant. But the Jews and the Christians, of course, deny that they are descendants of Abraham, because their mother was not Sarah, who was the slave woman from Egypt, Hajar. And they also deny that we worship Allah because they believe in their beliefs concerning Allah. Now, it's interesting that if you read Genesis 17, chapter 17, you find that the verse mentions that the sign, or what the word, the one who translated the King James Version said, the token, which means sign, of those people who will inherit the earth are that they will circumcise themselves. This was the covenant, the sign between Abraham and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that he was to circumcise himself. And the wisdom behind it, I mean, there is many wisdoms behind it. One of it is cleanliness and purity. But as Ibn al-Qayyim said, that it's not far to conceive that the idea of circumcision is in the same way that you brand an animal. I don't know if any of you brothers have been to a farm before. But if you've gone to a farm, especially like in the United States, like in the Southwest where you have cattle, cows, you know, and they go across great distances, or like in Arabia, camels. People brand their beast with some sort of insignia in order to tell that this is my camel, not your camel, or this is my cow and not your cow. So Ibn al-Qayyim, in one of his writings, he says that the idea of circumcision, I mean, even though he acknowledges it's for purity and has health reasons and so forth, and it's to reduce the sexual drive so we're not like animals, but he also says it is not far to imagine that it is a sign like the branding of a beast. But this is a sign of that you have been branded in the sense to be Allah's servant who you worship Him. And what happened, if we remember, I noticed that we saw Rahiq al-Makhtoum being sold there. For those of the brothers who have read the Prophet's Seerah, what happened when Heracles, the Caesar, the Christian king during the time of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, when he woke up from his dream, what did he say? He said, in a vision last night, I saw that the kingdom of the circumcised people have overtaken the lands of Palestine. The kingdom of the circumcised people. The Roman rulers, the governors, the Byzantines, the aides of Caesar, Heracles, the Christians said, we know no other person, no people who circumcise themselves except for the Jews. So if you would like, I will make an order that we kill every single Jew in your dominions. And this occurred just before the Prophet ﷺ was sent, or as he was sent, in the early part of his career, or just before his prophethood began. And what happened was, the orders to behead the Jews began from Palestine all the way to Spain. And even the Jews in Spain who were underneath the rulings or the laws of the Roman Empire or Byzantium were executed. They would execute them, in large numbers. Because they were afraid that this dream was an indication that they would be leaving, the Christians would be leaving the Holy Land, and that it would go to a circumcised people. What happened in history? Well, we know from the seerah of the Prophet ﷺ that when he was in Mecca, a great battle occurred between two people. The Persians, who were worshipping fire, and the Christians, the worshippers of the cross. And this battle occurred where? In Palestine, in Syria. And the Persians won, the fire worshippers. And when this happened, the Muslims became saddened in Mecca, because the pagans of Mecca said, you see, we're like the Persian fire worshippers. We don't believe in anything of neither a book or a scripture or like this. And here is the Christians who have a book and have a prophet, like you Muslims, and they lost. So therefore we're going to defeat you like they were defeated. So Allah sent down some verses, excuse me. Allah sent down some verses from Surah Al-Rum, which we call, based upon this matter. And Allah told us in the first 5 or 6 verses of Surah Al-Rum that the Byzantines or the Romans were defeated in a close land, and in a few years, a few odd years, they will be victorious. And on that day the believers will be happy. And it happened like that. So what happened was, when the Persians overtook Syria and Palestine, for those of you who might imagine the map of the world, you have Turkey up here, and then underneath Turkey you have Syria, Lebanon, and Palestine, and here you have Iraq, and here's Persia, and this is Arabia in the center, okay? I don't know if you saw that map very well. But the point is that the Persians came from the east, and they took those lands which they were in Iraq, I mean this was part of Persia. They took the lands which we would call now Syria, they took Damascus, they took Jerusalem, these areas, and they took Turkey, which was Christian land. And Caesar, Heraclius, was bottled up in Constantinople. He was bottled up in the capital of his, Constantinople. So he made a vow to Allah that if he was to defeat the Persians, if Allah was to give him victory over the Persians, he would walk from Constantinople to Jerusalem barefooted, carrying a cross, in thankfulness. While these events were happening, nobody in the world was paying attention to what was going on in Mecca. But in Mecca, the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ was preaching to Tawheed. And this message in Mecca was going to leave within a few years and come to these lands. And so then, when the Prophet ﷺ, some 10 years or 12 or 15 years later, made the peace treaty with the pagans of Mecca at Hudaybiyah, when the Prophet returned back to Medina and then came back and took Mecca, when the pagans breached the treaty of Hudaybiyah, the Prophet sent out emissaries to the different kings of the earth. He sent out messengers, the Prophet ﷺ, with letters calling the kings of the earth to become Muslims. What happened? While Caesar was doing his pilgrimage, and in Jerusalem, the Prophet's emissary comes to Jerusalem to give him the letter. See how Allah's qadr is? And he comes with a letter, which I'm sure you probably have read in Sahih Bukhari or elsewhere, where it says, from Muhammad, the messenger of Allah, to Heraclius, the leader or the king or the ruler of the Byzantines. Become a Muslim and you will be safe. And if you do not, you will have the sins of all your followers upon you. And then he put the verse from Surah Al-Imran that we should say to the people of the book, let us come to a common word between us and them. So when the letter came to Heraclius, Heraclius asked for his, people in his court, if they had anybody of the Arabs, those people who have sent this letter, in the area. And Abu Sufyan, who at that time was still a pagan, was on a trade trip to this area of Palestine. So they brought Abu Sufyan, and Abu Sufyan and his comrades, and they put Abu Sufyan in the front, and they put his comrades behind him so that he would not see them. And Heraclius told his interpreter that he's going to ask Abu Sufyan some questions concerning Muhammad ﷺ. And if he was to lie, Abu Sufyan, then his people behind him should make a gesture that he's lying. But of course Abu Sufyan would not know that because they were behind him. And so then he asked him those strange questions, like, what do you know of this man? What is his message? Was he a king before you? Was he descendant of a king? These questions, which are signs of the prophethood, that the Christian ruler knew, because he knew how the prophets were from his books, because he was also a scholar of his religion. And then Heraclius, the king of Rome, testified that Muhammad ﷺ was truly the messenger of Allah. And he said that he feared that it would not come shortly a day when he would take over the lands which they were in. Palestine, this land given to the Prophet Abraham. And we know from the seerah, Heraclius then tried to convince the Christians to accept Islam. So he called them the next day, he called his bishops and his leaders, his political leaders, his military leaders, and they filled up the church, and he locked the doors. And he said, what if I tell you that I'm going to become a Muslim? What would you say? And they started to get so angry they wanted to flee out of the thing. And then he said, no, I was just testing your obedience. I wasn't meaning that. So he gave up the kingdom of the hereafter for his earthly kingdom in this world. And he decided that he was going to then fight the Muslims. And he sent out his army of 100,000 people in the Battle of Mu'tah, where the Prophet's companions fought. And then the battles after the Prophet's death occurred when they defeated the armies of Heraclius and took, in the time of Umar al-Khattab, Jerusalem and these lands to return to Palestine. But the point is that if you look at Genesis, you can see that when they said in this passage that the covenant was to be given to Abraham and his seed, an everlasting covenant until the day of judgment, and the sign of the covenant is for a circumcised people, we are that circumcised people. And even our women are circumcised. Or many countries, Muslim women circumcised, and it's from the practice of the Prophet ﷺ's generation that women would circumcise. Not all the women, it's not something which is required like for men, but it's something from Islam. So it's not even that our men are circumcised, but also that our women are also, or many of our women, or some of our women are also circumcised. Now, we know that the Jews and Christians, of course, twist all these prophecies that are found in the Old Testament and New Testament that prove the Prophet of ﷺ, and twist all these historical incidents and facts. But let us continue with our discussion of what we find the Jews and Christians believing in Genesis. Okay. So as we find in the 15th chapter of Genesis, that the text of the Torah tells us what is this land that has been given to Abraham and his descendants. It says, unto thy seed, meaning Abraham's seed, his descendants, have I given this land from the river of Egypt, which is the Nile, unto the great river, the river of Euphrates, or the river Euphrates, which is in Iraq. So here the land is not just that land of Canaan which is given in the beginning, but it's given from the Nile to the Euphrates, from Egypt to Iraq. This is all supposed to be from this. And it's said that in the Israeli flag, for those of you who know, it has those two blue stripes, and then it has the Star of David in between. These two blue stripes are supposed to represent the two rivers. The river is Nile and the river is Euphrates. And the Jewish are meaning that this is their line between these two rivers based upon this text in Genesis. Alright, then after this we find Abraham dies in the Torah, it tells about his death and so forth, and then it brings us to his grandson, Jacob, Yaqub, who is known as also Israel. So we find that Jacob leaves Beersheba and he falls asleep between Beersheba and Haran, which is the land of Palestine. And in a dream it says that Allah comes to Jacob and says, I am the Lord God of Abraham, thy father, and the God of Isaac. The God of Isaac, because Abraham is his grandfather and Isaac is his father, two prophets of Allah. A land wherein thou liest, to thee will I give it, and to thy seed. And thy seed shall be as the dust of the earth. And thou shalt spread abroad to the west, and to the east, and to the north, and to the south. And in thee and in thy seed shall all the families of the earth be blessed. Now, what is specific about this? This prophecy which we gave to Abraham, I mean, you can say that it could have gone to any of Abraham's descendants, or to all of his descendants, in the sense that it was given to Abraham, and Abraham had more than one descendant. But here, it specifically is given to whom? To Jacob, to the prophet Yaqub alayhi salam, and his descendants. So in other words, it is an exclusion to the other branch of Abraham, the Arabs or Ismail, from which the Prophet ﷺ came from. But this text is a lie, because look what it says. It says that thy seed shall be as the dust of the earth. In other words, the children of Israel shall be as so numerous as the dust of the earth. And thy seed shall spread abroad to the west and to the east, to the north, to the south. And in thee and in thy seed shall all the families of the earth shall be blessed. Now, let us look at that. Are the Jews of such numbers that they are like the dust of the earth? No. They are the most fewest of people in the world. And also, the majority of the Jews are not from the children of Israel. The majority of the Jews are either people who have become Jewish, but were not themselves from the children descendants of Israel, like the Eastern European Jewry, who are a bunch of people which were known as the Khazars, people in the Caucasus Mountains, this area of Shishan and so forth. Whole large numbers of them became Jewish at one time. Why? Because they were being crushed. They were a pagan people. They were being crushed by two forces. The Muslims were coming from the south, and the Christians from the north, from Moscow. And so therefore, they didn't want to become Muslims because they liked to drink wine. And they didn't want to become Christians because if they became Christians, the Muslims would wage jihad against them, because this is the Muslims' enemy. They said, okay, the best thing to do is become Jews. And so then these Jews, you have Eastern European Jewry, which is spread now throughout Eastern Europe and now all settled in Palestine and so forth. The majority of these people are not the children of, descendants of the children of Israel. Likewise, the Falasha Jew in Ethiopia. Can we say that the Falasha Jew also in Ethiopia is also a descendant of the children of Israel? And the Arab Jew, the Jew of Morocco and Yemen and Iraq and so forth, these are also descendants of the prophet Isaac. So even if you were to extract all these children of Israel from the Jews, how many true Jews left on the earth are also children of Israel? This shows that this prophecy was never intended for Isaac, but they changed their books. And the prophecy is for the children of Ismail, the Arabs, the Ummah of Muhammad ﷺ, because they are become like the dust of the earth. And their families have mixed. You find now in Iran, among the Persian people, you find people who are of Arab stock, who were originally Arab people who came there with Islam. In Afghanistan, you find people who are originally from Arab descent. In China, you find people who are originally from Arab descent. In Turkey, in Africa. I mean, you can go into some places of West Africa where you find the descendants of Umar ibn al-Khattab. And yet they appear just like the African people. How come? Because when the Sahaba spread and the Arabs spread with Islam, they went throughout all the earth and they mixed with the peoples. And so therefore, and it's also through the children of Ismail alayhi salam, when they accepted at the time of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, that all the peoples of the earth were blessed, as we discussed earlier. So this is what the Jewish belief is based upon. The Jewish belief is based upon these prophecies, which they have misinterpreted and corrupted, to say that they are the inheritors of the earth. And that also this lie which they have attributed to Noah, that Noah became drunken, and that therefore the other peoples of the earth are to be their servants and slaves, to work for their ends. Okay, now comes the question, what about the Christians? Somebody might say, well, these are all concerning the Jews, the Old Testament. Why are the Christians involved? Let us now investigate the issue of the Christians. Remember, I said to you in the beginning, and I'm sure all of you know, because this is basically a Christian country, you might say, that the Christian book, the Bible, what they call the Holy Bible, is divided into two parts, two testaments, an Old Testament and a New Testament. And it is in the Old Testament that these prophecies occur, which they believe in. So any Christian, when he opens up his Holy Bible, the first thing he's going to read are these prophecies, because he sees himself as an extension of that. Now, somebody might say that, for instance, that the Christians have been known throughout history, I mean even until recent times, like in Germany in World War II, to persecute the Jews. So how is it that they are standing side by side with the Jews? This is what we'd like to investigate now. We all know that all three religions, the Jews, Christians, and Muslims, believe that the final battle of history will occur, and in that final battle of history, its religion would become the victorious over the earth, and all other religions will be wiped out. And that the leader of this great final battle will be a leader which is not like other leaders which we are used to, but he will be a special leader. He will be divinely supported and aided, and that his name is the Messiah, Al-Messiah. And so therefore, as Ibn al-Qayyim says, the three nations all await an expected one who will come forth from the end of time. All three groups of people wait this expected one. For each religion was promised this individual. In each scripture you find this. And the Muslims awaits, of course, for the return of Isa ibn Maryam, who, as the Prophet ﷺ has told us, will be a Muslim ruler, judging by the Quran and the Sunnah, and he will break the cross, meaning put an end to Christianity, and he will not accept the jizya, meaning people will either become Muslim or they'll be put to the sword. And he will exterminate the pig, which the Christians have made lawful for themselves. And we also know that during his time, he will lead the Muslim forces who will fight a battle against the Antichrist, a Dajjal, who will have amongst his followers 70,000 Jews from the city of Isfahan. And that Isa ibn Maryam will kill the Masih al-Dajjal with his spear, his javelin, and he will show his blood to the Muslims. And then the Jews will flee when they see that their king has fallen, and they will hide behind rock and tree, and rock and tree will say, "O Muslim, O Abdullah, there is a Jew behind me, come and kill him." This is what the Muslims believe. And the Christians believe that the Messiah will come down, Jesus the son of Mary, and he will exterminate all the people of Canaan, the Muslims in other words, and the Jews in the Battle of Armageddon. And the Jews believe, according to the Talmud, that when the Messiah comes, who they do not believe is Isa ibn Maryam, he will come and he will exterminate all the Christians and the Muslims. So each religion is waiting for the Messiah to come. The Muslims and the Christians are in agreement to his identity, that it's Jesus the son of Mary. But they are disagreement as to who is Isa ibn Maryam. Christians believing that he is the son of Allah, and that he is, Muslims believing that he is a prophet of Allah. And the Muslims and Christians are in agreement that the Messiah will exterminate the Antichrist, which we call in English, or Dajjal of the Jews, the kings of the Jews. We're in agreement to this. And so based upon this, the future battle, what's going to happen is going to be a battle between two messiahs. One of them, the Antichrist, whom the Jews believe in and call, listen to this very carefully, they call him, according to the Bible, he is known as the Prince of Peace. And this is what? The era of peace, they say. And they prepare for his arrival. They don't call him the Antichrist. I mean, even though the Muslims and the Christians believe that when the King of the Jews comes, he will be the Antichrist, the Jews do not believe he's the Antichrist. They believe he's the true Messiah. And the other one, the other Messiah who will engage in the battle, is the true Messiah, the son of Mary alayhi salam, who the Muslims and Christians both believe will descend from the heavens and return to earth. Now, the Jews and Christians agree that this expected Messiah will be from the children of Israel. I mean, they're in agreement that he will be a descendant of the children of Israel. And the Muslims also agree that because Isa ibn Maryam was from Bani Israel. And the Christians and Jews believe that he will descend among the children of Israel. This is what we disbelieve in. We believe that when Isa comes down, alayhi salam, he will not come down among the children of Israel, but he will come among the ranks of the Muslims as they pray Salat al-Fajr, as they are preparing for Salat al-Fajr. The Jews and Christians believe that he will come down and descend where? Among the children of Israel. And therefore they believe that the children of Israel will be his soldiers and his supporters, and that the capital of Jesus will be Jerusalem. This is what the Christians and Jews believe. And they also believe that his return will come at the beginning of a millennium, at the beginning of 1,000 years. Okay. So they believe that he will come amongst the children of Israel, and they believe that he will come at the beginning of 1,000 years, at the turn of a millennium, and that the children of Israel will be his soldiers and his supporters. What do they base this belief upon? Well, they base it upon some of the interpretations that they have of the revelation of St. John the Divine, which is one of the last books in the New Testament. You know, the New Testament has many books in it, right? And one of the books is called the Book of Revelation, where they say that John, who they claim is one of the Hawariyun, one of the apostles of Jesus, you know, disciples of Jesus, that he had a dream where Jesus came to him and said, this is what is going to happen in the future. And based upon this interpretation, they say they have these ideas. And they also base it upon the dreams of certain of their monks, of their religious leaders and their rabbis, and the visions of some soothsayers, like Nostradamus. They also interpret events based upon this. And therefore, before the Gulf War 5 years ago in 1990, when the Christians came to the lands of the Muslims and the war was going to come, the level of intensity of faith in the return of Jesus reached very high proportions in America and in Europe and elsewhere among the Christians. Because some of them thought that this battle of the Gulf War was the beginning of the Battle of Armageddon, and that Jesus was going to come any moment. And so therefore, as we now approach the end of this 1,000 years, the second millennium, and we start now the third millennium, the year 2000, it's just only how many years away? Just 3.5 or 4 years away. We find that two dreams converge where this bogus promise, this bogus interpretation of the covenant of God given to Abraham comes about. The first is the Christian dream, a dream for 2,000 years now, that the Messiah, Jesus the son of Mary, will return, descend back to earth, and in the Battle of Armageddon, as we shall express, will kill the Jews and Muslims and all those who don't follow the religion. And the Jewish dream, which they've had now for 5,000 years, that their king will come among the descendants of David, who will kill the Christians and Muslims and make humanity slaves for the state of Israel. And this king is none other than the Antichrist, as we know. And it was from this standpoint that the Jews and the Christians agreed that they have to create the state of Israel and put all the Jews back in the state of Israel in order to prepare for the return of the Messiah, according to each interpretation. Because each group is waiting a Messiah. And so therefore, even though logically it would seem that in this time period Muslims and Christians should be in unity and working together to fight the Jews, because we all agree, Muslims and Christians, that the true Messiah is Jesus the son of Mary. And we all agree that the Messiah of the Jews is the false Messiah, the Antichrist, who the Muslims would fight. So a logical review would mean that in this period of time, the Christians should be helping the Muslims fighting the Jews. And that a war, an unrelenting war, would occur between the Christians and the Jews, because in preparation for that final battle between the two Messiahs. But what has happened? Are the Christians on the side of the Muslims in this issue? They're on the side of the Jews. What is this indicative of? This shows us the deeply rooted hate the Christians have, where they are willing to give up all their monetary benefits that they can gain. As one person said some 15, 20 years ago, they're willing to give up all the oil of OPEC for a bunch of oranges that come out of Israel. They're willing to give up all these monetary benefits, all this, also the religious benefits, which the religious necessities of the religious beliefs, in order to work with the Jews. And so therefore, they came up with this idea. Let's not discuss the details of how the Messiah is going to come back. What we should do now is just prepare for his coming, and then when Jesus comes back, or when not Jesus, the Messiah comes back, we'll see. If he's the Messiah of the Jews, we all become Jews. If he's the Messiah of the Christians, then you all will become Christians or face the sword. And so therefore the Jews and the Christians came together and said it's in our interest for us to leave this issue hanging as to his identity and work at putting the Jews back in the state of Israel, the land of Palestine, to prepare for the coming of the Messiah and work against their common enemy. Who? The Muslims. And therefore, we find that Jews and Christians are standing side by side for the first time in history for this matter. Throughout history, Christians have been persecuting Jews. And so therefore, it is not surprising why we find the Jews and Christians standing side by side if we look at this issue in this way. But what is surprising is that why would the Muslims, the Arabs in particular, run behind these Jews and Christians? And so therefore let us review three events of this century. Now, we know that at the beginning of this century, at the year 1900, like in the end of the 1800s, 1880s and 1890s, the Christians said, well, if Jesus is to come back, If he doesn't come back at the beginning of this last century, meaning in the year 1900, he's going to come back at the end of the 1990s, in the year 2000. And so therefore, in the end of the 1800s, there was a great movement for the return of Jesus. Among one of these groups that occurred during this time were the Jehovah's Witnesses, which thought that Jesus was going to come back in the first part of this century. And so therefore, a conspiracy to put the Jews in the state of Israel and to prepare for the Messiah, to create an Israel, occurred. The first event was World War I, which among its aims and consequences was that the Uthmani state, the Khilafah, would be dismembered, and that they would put an end to this Khilafah, which even though the Khilafah at that time, I mean by the time of World War I, was basically figurative in meaning, and most of the Muslim lands were under the rules of either direct or indirect rule of the colonies to the Western powers, and the Khilafah had reached certain weakness, which was, was unable to really last much longer. However, though, it resembled a symbol in the minds of Muslims, of Muslim unity. It was just that psychological symbol. So this was one of their aims. And in fact, in the papers, if you go to any library, especially for those brothers in college, you can open up your old papers from the year 1914, 1915, 1916, these years of World War I, and look at the headlines written in like the London Times concerning World War I and what they were saying about how the Khilafah must end. This is, in the newspapers you'll find. And the slogan in England in those days was, "The Turk must go." In other words, the Uthmani Khilafah must come out, must go, must put to an end. So they used to say, "The Turk must go." This was the war slogan of World War I, because the Uthmanis were Turkish, as we all know. And also, part of the aims, or one of the results of World War I, was the declaration that the Jews had a right to establish a homeland in Israel, what was known as the Balfour Declaration. And that is because when the final Uthmani Khalifa, Sultan Abdul Hamid, refused to accept the Jewish bride by Theodore Herzl in the end of the 1800s, Theodore Herzl came to the Uthmanis and said, "Listen, we'll buy from you Palestine. Give you all the gold you want. Give us Palestine." So when he refused, they decided to remove the Uthmani Khilafah, and Balfour, Lord Balfour here, who was the foreign minister, and who was a fanatical evangelical, as we will see, came out with this declaration that the Jews have a right to establish a homeland, a national home in Palestine. Now, what was the position of the Muslims during this time? The Muslims decided to follow Lawrence of Arabia, galloping in the desert of Arabia to fight their brethren, the Uthmanis, the Turks, and through the armies of the Arabs, they allowed the British to take over Palestine and take over Syria and take over Iraq by fighting, the Muslims being turned to fight against the Uthmanis. And when Lord Allenby, the general of the British forces in the Middle East, entered into Jerusalem, he went to Mount of Olives, which is a hill in Jerusalem where Jesus gave his Sermon on the Mount, the very famous khutbah, which is in the Testament and so forth. And he planted his flag on the Mount of Olives, the Union Jack, and said, "Only now have the Crusades come to an end. Only now the Crusades have come to an end." What occurred during this time? Then we find that also Woodrow Wilson, the American president, comes up with the idea of a League of Nations, where they would rule these different lands of the Muslim world, and they split it up into small countries, and we have now the nationalism which we are suffering from. What was the second event that occurred this century? Second major event was World War II. And World War II occurred also a number of matters. In World War II we find that Nazism, which the Germans adopted, and which was a direct challenge to the Jewish Zionism, was defeated. And communism, Russian communism, was glorified because the Russians were one of the allies. A country, a state, which was established by the Jews, because most of the founders of communism were Jews, like Marx and Lenin and Engels, and which glorifies Jewish beliefs. Communism has many beliefs which are drawn from Judaism. And again, the Muslims were deceived by the promises of the West and return to fighting on the side and becoming soldiers for the West. Indeed, one fatwa was given that the British, the British at that time, of course, were ruling India. It was before India was partitioned and had its independence. And the British were also ruling Egypt, because before Egypt's independence. And the Germans were also in Africa. And a great battle occurred, called the Battle of Alamein, where the Germans fought the British in Egypt. Okay. Now the British needed soldiers, so they brought many Muslims from India to fight in their ranks. And they also brought with them shuyukh, to give them a fatwa that to fight the Germans was, what? Jihad in the path of Allah. And so again, the Muslims were duped and confused into believing that to fight the Germans was jihad in the path of Allah. Not to say, this does not mean, that to fight with the Germans is jihad. But the point is that this is a war between Christian powers. What does it have to do with the Muslims being on any side, and much less being jihad in the path of Allah? And then, of course, we find afterwards, after the end or before the conclusion of World War II, we find the Declaration of the United Nations and its charter in San Francisco, and the slogan that the right of each people to have self-determination and the rights of every people to have the freedoms of human rights, all these slogans which the West still mimics today, and through it control the populations of the earth through these hypocritical slogans. What was the third event that happened this century? Third event happened just a few years ago, in the end of the 80s, with the collapse of communism, and what was entitled the International Reconciliation between the Russians and the Americans. After World War II, the world was divided into two camps of people. The Eastern Bloc, which was based upon a dictatorial communism, and they had satellites throughout the world, countries which followed them, and you had the Western Bloc, which is based upon liberalism and secularism, the West, led by America. And it existed between both blocs something which was called a Cold War, which at times became real war. And they fought in many different places around the world. You had the crisis in Cuba in the 60s, you had the battles in Angola, you had the Vietnam conflict, you had the Middle East conflict, you had the battle in Afghanistan. These were all different battles that occurred between these people, and Korea before that in the 50s, between these two blocs in different parts of the world. But with the collapse of communism, when it was decided that communism was to come to an end, the role for communism was to come to an end, communism, the Christians quickly, all of a sudden, returned back to the old Western Christian camp. And the international reconciliation occurred when the first meeting between Reagan and Gorbachev in Malta in the 80s. And since that time, what has happened? What was the old Eastern Bloc, the Russians, who are now Orthodox Christians, all of a sudden, overnight, become Orthodox Christians, and the West have become a single stick to clobber the Muslims. And therefore you find now an issue which is happening this day in Chechnya, where 10 years ago, or not even 10 years ago, maybe 8 years ago or less, when the Russians were fighting the Muslims in Afghanistan, before the international reconciliation, before the New World Order, the American government, the Europeans, were assisting the Mujahideen to fight the Russians. And now in Chechnya, the West, through the IMF, is giving billions of dollars in loans, interest-free loans or low-interest loans, extended loans, to the Russians, in other words, in order to actually finance the war against the Muslims in the Caucasus. And so therefore, they have become now a single stick to clobber the Muslims. And the same thing we saw in Bosnia, where the Russians were sending volunteers to fight with the Serbians. They were sending oil and resources and money to the Serbians, and yet the West was holding the hands of the Muslims so the Muslims could not aid their brethren in Bosnia. And the slaughter that occurred in Bosnia is well known. So this mask has ended, and people now have accepted this idea of a one world, new world order, a one unified world, a single government, with the West leading, with American control and dominance over the world. And what has happened? The peace process has grown out of this. And so you have now this big heavy stick to smash the head of any Muslim who's going to stand up. And the doors of, after the international reconciliation, the Jews of Eastern Europe, which was the greatest Jewish population after America, all migrated, all these Russian Jews and Eastern European Jewry came to Israel to become soldiers and indoctrinated for the battle against the Muslims. And the Jewish finance houses of New York and London and elsewhere to control the wealth of the Muslims, especially the oil wealth, through the peace process, by which the Arabs and the Muslims will become, in the third world, slave laborers for the Jewish finance houses and the Jewish economy, world-driven economy of Western companies and so forth. This is exactly what's happening now. Go to Malaysia, go to Bangladesh. You find these massive Western companies now moving to these lands. Why? Because they want to help Muslim economies? No, because they want your cheap labor. So you go now to Bangladesh, you go down to Malaysia, perhaps even the sneakers that most of you brothers are wearing were produced in Malaysia and Indonesia, where you find Muslim women working in basically in slave conditions, 12, 14, 16 hours a day for maybe less than $1 a day to make shoes, which they make the money off and then they sell back to us, as we are the consumers. We are their laborers. We toil all day long to produce the product for them, and then they take that product and sell it back to us again. Now, so in order to facilitate the world conditions, it's necessary for the West, it was necessary for them to destroy any single military might in the Islamic world. And so therefore the Gulf War occurred. Not because the Gulf War occurred because the Iraqi government, a unbelieving apostate government, is going to give victory to Islam. For the military might which was developed there might one day be inherited by the Muslims. I mean, one day it's conceivable that the Muslims would change the situation in Iraq, and then all that military might and expertise and technological expertise, right, would be Muslim powers. Because those people, even though now they're being ruled by an unbelieving regime, and it's a regime which is a butcher regime and so forth, but nonetheless the people in their essence are Muslims. We saw this in Bosnia. The Bosnians were underneath communist rule for 50, 60, 70 years. They knew nothing of Islam. I mean, Bosnians were just Muslims because they were just Muslims, that's all. His name was Muhammad instead of his name being, I don't know what Bosnian name is, his Serb name. Harris or whatever, not a Harris, no, Mikhailovich or something like that, So the point is that, his name was, Muhammadovich instead of Mikhailovich or something like that. That's why he was a Muslim. And so when the Serbs were killing them, they had no idea why they were being killed. They said, you're our neighbors and we marry you, we all drink beer together, what's the big deal? But what happened within a few years? The Bosnians started to return to Islam. You now find in Sarajevo and different cities in Bosnia, women wearing hijab, some even women wearing niqab. So the Muslim peoples, even though they are ignorant of their religion, when they have the opportunity to be taught and dawah to be given to them, they return unto Allah. There is still good present in the hearts of the Muslims. They just need somebody to go out there and preach to them and to remove these forces and these ideas away from them so that you can grow and let them develop. And so therefore the fear of the West was, even though they had built the armies of Iraq, that it would one day be inherited by the Muslims. And so therefore they had to destroy it. And this is what's happening throughout the Islamic world. No Muslim country is allowed to develop to the level where it might become a powerful nation, or it might in the future become a land. In Pakistan, when Zia al-Haq, with all his faults and all his matters which we would disagree with, right? But because he had an Islamic sort of sense to him, okay? Because he had an Islamic spirit in him, they assassinated him. And when they assassinated him, they were willing to assassinate the American ambassador on the airplane with them. And they switched the situation in Pakistan, as Pakistan was supporting the Muslims, and there was a growth in Pakistan towards implementing the Sharia, was all of a sudden switched, and who has now taken over? Who is the model of Islamic, sisterhood or motherhood, I don't know what, but I mean, has come about. So see, the point is that the West will not allow any Muslim country to reach a level of development. Even though the people might be secularists or so forth, in the fear that in one day, the Muslims might then, the Dawah might spread and take over the resources. So they'll engage it in civil war, they'll engage it in a war they will cause it some sort of problem in order that the Muslims will never reach that level. Not that these regimes themselves will carry the battle of Islam, but in the fear that one day they will inherit, the Muslims of that land will inherit that. Most of the Muslim population in the world today is under 21 years old. Under 21 years old. The population in Algeria now, for instance, it is said that more than 60% of the people in Algeria are under 16 years old. More than 60%. If more than 60% of a country is under 16 years old, if you had Islamic schools, within one generation, those will be the Muslims that you need. But if a bunch of 16 years old kids are living in circumstances of civil war, living in circumstances of confusion and displacement and poverty, where people cannot go to school and not learn and know there's no dawah, and people are engaged in fighting and killing each other, how can you imagine that an ummah will come about of that? You will not have an ummah. You will have a generation of lost people, lost youth, who when they are in their 20s and 30s will know nothing but killing. Will know nothing of Islam. They will not be capable of doing anything. They will be uneducated either in worldly or religious matters. Like in Somalia. Somalia has a very young population. If you look at the demographics, take the United Nations statistics, it's very young. But the Somalis cannot be imagined that at this time, that this generation will be able to do anything, because it's a lost generation. They know only clan warfare and killing and so forth. Not one of them has sat down in school for one day to learn something. So it's a lost cause. And so this is what is happening. Because in one generation the Islamic world can change if there are schools, if there is dawah, because the population of the Islamic world is extremely young. And it said, I think the latest thing I read, that the majority, maybe more than 50% of the whole Islamic world is under than 21 years old. And of those 1 billion Muslims, it said that maybe more than 50% is under 21. Do you see how the youth, you could change a generation within 30 years, those youth could become the parents of a new generation, which would be upon Islam? But it's important then therefore that these youth never reach their potential. Because they're diverted from that by one way or the other. Either corrupted into living lives where the role model is Michael Jackson and Madonna, or caught into starvation and displacement, or caught into an issue of warfare and civil unrest, or caught to follow all these strange and sects and so forth, and deviant groups like Sufis and Shias and so forth, all to set them off from the path of Allah. Now, when the Messiah descends, what do the three groups, going back, that was a sort of long diversion, what will be the humanity's future when the Messiah descends? All three religions agree that when the Messiah descends and after annihilating his enemies, humanity will live under a single world government. This is the first issue of substance. And the second issue of substance is that peace will prevail throughout the world. And so under the shade of this one government, there will be no need for war between nations and peoples. Indeed, the world will no longer need armies and weapons. And so therefore, it is from this concept that the Jews and Christians have decided to manipulate to set up this new world order. And if you go to the United Nations building in New York City, and you look at the cornerstone, you'll find something very strange there. You'll find a passage from Isaiah concerning the return of Messiah, and then when he returns, people will beat their swords into plowshares, and there will be no more war, and peace will be throughout the earth. It is this idea that has propelled them to set up this new world order. And this is how the Americans have decided to manipulate the issue. Because if there's going to be a single world government, where all nations are going to live under a single ruler, then why not let it be an American ruler? And so here American opportunism enters into the picture. Because the American ruler, when he's going to now use, and he's going to now manipulate his resources to serve the Jewish aims, he has to raise the flag of American nationalism high in order to do that. So now, how much time do we have for this session?
No problem.
Okay. So now let us investigate in the details, after we've set now the theoretical basis of the beliefs or the ideological framework for these beliefs. Let us now investigate how was this bogus promise, how was this bogus covenant set up regarding the Christians and the Jews. So we said earlier that the Christians believe that at the conclusion of 1,000 years, the Messiah will return and will rule the earth for 1,000 years. And upon the basis of this belief, their hopes unified and their sights were directed to the end of the first millennium. And if you look at any book of European history, you'll find in the year 1000 a lot of strange things happened. All these Europeans started to leave their homes and their villages and go to the mountains and sit there waiting for Jesus to come back, because they felt that he was going to come back after 1,000 years. Well, they sat there for a while, got cold and hungry, they realized he wasn't coming back, so they said, okay, back into our homes, let's wait for another 1,000 years. So even though the issue died out in the reality of the day-to-day affairs, the dream and the hope still remained alive in their hearts and in their minds, that at the end of 1,000 years, Isa will come back. And it was prior to the beginning of this century, that is near the year 1900, that these claims began anew. The Christians believed that if Jesus wasn't going to appear at the beginning of the 20th century, in the 1900s, then he must appear at the year 2000. And since his appearance will be in his homeland, it was necessary to prepare the ground for his coming by restoring all the children of Israel, all the Jews, to the land of Palestine, upon which the decisive great war of Armageddon will occur. And the Christians today believe, Christian fundamentalists, that this battle of Armageddon, which will occur in this land of Palestine, will occur with, some have claimed, 400 million soldiers. And they believe what was going to happen is this, that the Christians, that the Muslims will attack the Jews in Israel, and as a result, the battle will pursue, and Jesus will come down to save his people, the Jews. And so what he will do is he will take the Christians up into the clouds, which is what they call the rapture, and then the Christians, those who will remain before he takes them up the clouds, they will send their nuclear bombs upon the Muslims and destroy them. And for this reason, one author has written in a book describing this Christian viewpoint, the Christian fundamentalist. She says, and I'm quoting, "Convinced that a nuclear Armageddon is an inevitable event within the divine scheme of things, many evangelical dispensationalists," dispensationalism is a type of Christian creed, "have committed themselves to a course for Israel that by their own admission will lead directly to a Holocaust indescribably more savage and widespread than any vision of carnage that could have been generated in Adolf Hitler's criminal mind." And there are many books of this. One of the most popular books concerning the subject was a book that appeared in the 70s. And this book sold 19 million copies in the 70s. And it was by an author called Hal Lindsey. And it was called The Late Great Planet Earth. And in this book, which you find in every single airport in the world, you find that it describes in a dramatic fashion the coming of the end of the world and the battle of Armageddon. And what will happen? He gives you an image of what's going to happen. Recently, the same individual, Hal Lindsey, and I forgot to bring the book with me, but I'll bring it tomorrow, inshallah, has written another book. Just came out this year or the year before. Do you have it with you? No. And it's called The Final Battle, where he gives you on the cover a picture of a mushroom cloud, nuclear mushroom cloud. And you might imagine who that cloud has fallen upon, that nuclear bomb has been rained upon, the Muslims. And that is because the Christians will believe that the Battle of Armageddon will conclude with a total victory for the Christians and a complete destruction of the idolaters, that is the Muslims. And that this will occur when the Christians with the Messiah are raised above the clouds, and the Muslims will then drown, according to Revelation 19:20, where it said a lake of fire burning with brimstone. They say this lake of fire burning with brimstone is the nuclear bombs which we will be followers of Christ and the Messiah. and have taken him as a god apart from Allah, they will all be saved. Every single one of them. Whoever's got a cross on his soldier will be a cross on his chest will be saved. All these Christians will be saved. Even the whores of Paris and Chicago, even the gamblers of Las Vegas, and the queers of San Francisco, and the drug addicts of Miami, they all will be raised above the clouds when the nuclear bombs come upon the Muslims. And the only ones who will be destroyed will be the Muslims, the people of Tawheed, the people of worship of Allah. Even if you're at the Kaaba, clinging on to the Kaaba, you will be destroyed when this occurs. And this is the belief of many American presidents. 7 American presidents have held this belief of Armageddon. For instance, we find that Jimmy Carter, in 1979, on March 13th, when he traveled to Israel after the signing of the Camp David Accords, he gave a speech at the Israeli Knesset, where he said, 7 American presidents have believed and demonstrated that America's relationship with Israel is more than just a special relationship. It has been, and it is a unique relationship. And it is a relationship which is indestructible, because it is rooted in the consciousness and the morals and the religions and the beliefs of the American people themselves. Israel and the United States were shaped by immigrant pioneers, and we share the heritage of the Bible, meaning the Old Testament in this case. And so these American presidents believe that the battle now in the Middle East is a battle between Goliath and David. And David is the state of Israel, and Goliath are the Arabs. So we are the pagan Philistines, and they are the recipients of the prophets. And that's why we find that President Reagan, the president 2 presidents ago, on more than 11 occasions stated that he believed that the world was going to come to an end, and that he believed in the coming of the Battle of Armageddon. In fact, it was reported in the New York Times that during a conversation with the director of AIPAC, the Israeli lobby, Reagan said to the director of the Israeli lobby in America, "You know, I turn back to your ancient prophets in the Old Testament and the signs foretelling Armageddon. And I find myself wondering if we're that generation that's going to see that come about. I don't know if you noticed I don't know if you have noticed any of the prophecies lately, but believe me, they certainly describe the times we are going through." Mike Evans, one of the Christian fundamentalist leaders, who was originally a Jew who adopted Christianity, relates that in 1985, Reagan invited him and Jim Baker, who was another Christian fundamentalist who fell into dishonor because he had sexual relations with a woman, something I guess uncommon for Christians, and Jimmy Swaggart, another one of them, and Jerry Falwell. And Mike Evans says, myself and a few others met with him in private, and I will never forget what he told us. The president, meaning Reagan, expressed the belief that America was on the verge of a spiritual awakening, and I believe it with all my heart. God is raising up people like you and me in intercessory prayer and love to prepare the world for the return of the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords, meaning by this Messiah, because they believe that Jesus is Allah, Ta'ala and Dhalika Uluwan Kabira. And likewise, George Bush also had very close ties with the fundamentalists. And likewise, the current American president, Clinton, his work and his closeness to the Jews, is so obvious. How many times have we seen him wearing the Jewish yarmulke on his head and reading Jewish prayers and praying upon their graves as if he was a Jewish rabbi himself? And so therefore, the American presidents, and American, as we have seen from the statement of Carter, 7 American presidents, he said from Carter's time, and since that time we've had 3 presidents, Reagan and Bush and also Clinton. So 10 presidents have held this belief in these Christian ideals. But what do they hold concerning Islamic fundamentals? And what do they regard us sitting in this room? Do they look at us with such loving eyes as they look at their own fundamentalists or not? Well, we can determine their position from the statements of President Nixon, who, as you know, died a couple of years ago. He wrote a book called 1999, Victory Without War. And this is a title that reeks with these beliefs Because, he said 1999, just a year before the millennium, victory without war. In other words, the age of peace is going to be ushered in. And he talks about the ascendancy of a single world government and what America must do. And he says, Nixon says, and in the Middle East, we see the traditional rivalry of Arab versus Jew evolving into a conflict between Islamic fundamentalists on the one hand and Israel and the moderate Arab states on the other. Now, he wrote this book in the early 1990s, before the Gulf War. What did he say? The Mideast tradition, was first Arab against Jew, is now going to become what? Arabs and Jews against Muslim fundamentalists. And this is why I said that the summit of the peacemakers is just an indication of this declaration of war against us. And he also says, in the Muslim world, from Morocco to Indonesia, Islamic fundamentalism has replaced communism as the principal instrument of violent change. And he also says, telling America to return back to its Christian roots, giving words that only the most arrogant and haughty fundamentalists would say. He says that when America was weak and poor 200 years ago, we were sustained by our faith. In other words, when America was formed in 1776, America was sustained by their faith when they were weak and poor. And then he says, as we enter into our 3rd century and the next millennium, we must rediscover and reinvigorate our faith. And likewise, Nixon also said, at the conclusion of the first famous Reagan-Gorbachev summit, which I talked about in Malta, Foreign Affairs magazine quoted Nixon as saying that the United States and Russia must unite together to fight Islamic fundamentalism, which has, occurred as we saw in Bosnia and now in Chechnya. Okay, so therefore this idea of returning the Jews back to Palestine first began with the Christians. The idea of Zionism first began with the Christians. Should we stop now at this time to give a break to the brothers? Or? Okay, 10 minutes agreeing. So don't. I won't be long, inshallah. So this idea first started with the Christians. And that, unlike what most of us think who studied history, modern history, think that the first call to Zionism began with Theodor Herzl in Switzerland in the 1800s, but it really began 4 centuries before that amongst the Christians. And if we do not understand this, we will not be able to understand why the West supports the Jews in this conflict. How were the Jews formerly treated in Europe? For those of you who have studied history know that the Jews are cursed in the New Testament. The Jews are cursed. Indeed, we know from the Quran that Allah cursed the Jews from before the time of Jesus alayhi salam. Because Allah tells us in the Quran, in Surah 5, verse 78, Surah Al-Ma'idah, that cursed were the unbelievers of the children of Israel by the tongue of David and Jesus, son of Mary. That for the rebelling and their transgression. The Jews are accursed, that the Christians realizing this, that they are murderers and bloodsuckers, was not the reason for Christian enmity. But the Christian enmity towards the Jews is because the Christians believe that the Jewish crime is that they killed the Lord Jesus. The Christians believe that the Jews killed God. And so therefore an enmity occurred between them from those days. But as Allah spoke truthfully when He told us in Surah An-Nisa that they neither slayed Him nor crucified Him, meaning Jesus. And as a result of this, the Roman Catholic Church, who is located in Rome, as you know, has continued to curse and show enmity to the Jews in an amazing way. One of the oddities of this enmity and this animosity was that in the Middle Ages, when a dangerous plague spread in Europe, which was known as the Black Death, and killed millions of people, laid whole cities to waste, the Pope declared, or it's not the Pope, but at least certain Christians declared that the cause of this disease was the Jews. So they used to put the Jews to the sword. It is as if any and all filth and evil in the world is to be laid at the doorstep of the Jews. And as a result, the Jews faced much persecution in Europe and faced violent cleansing. Ethnic cleansing began with the Jews in Europe. It occurred in the 13th and 14th and 15th centuries in Britain, in Germany, in France, and other European countries and cities. Jews were cast out, were killed, were expelled in order to cleanse the societies from the evil of the Jews. And that is because the Europeans, the Christians, saw them as the most dangerous and most evil of Allah's creatures. And it was from this hell of Europe that the Jews fled to where? To the sanctuary of Al-Andalus, of Islamic Spain, where they were sheltered by the Muslims. And when the Christians overtook Al-Andalus and removed the last Muslim stronghold or foothold in Andalus, which was in Granada in 1492, the Christians then began to expel the Muslims and the Jews from Al-Andalus. And what became as the Inquisition occurred. And so the Jews were forced to flee with the Muslims, and the Jews fled to the Muslim lands, especially the Turkish areas under Turkish control, like Greece and the Balkans and so forth, and Cyprus and these lands. And it was during this historical period, when the Muslims were taken out of Al-Andalus, that Allah decreed that two significant events occur. Two significant events which we live its aftermath until today, even though it's 500 years has passed. The first event was the discovery of America by the Europeans, a historical geographical event. And the second event was the emergence of the Protestant movement in Christianity and the split of the church. And with that, let me stop to give the brothers a chance to take a break, because I think they're tired, huh? Give them 10 minutes or something like that, huh? A break. And we'll pick up from there and continue in about 10 minutes. Jazakumullah khair. Alhamdulillah. والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله وبعد. Alright, we're continuing our discussion now of the historical events that have led to the current Middle East situation. And we mentioned that it was in the year 1492, or in that period of the 15th and 16th centuries, that two major events occurred that Allah decreed. One of which, geographical, the other religious. And it is the confluence of these two events that has resulted in the creation, or the resulting from that, the greatest power inimical to Islam in the world today, the United States of America. These two events were the European discovery of America, a historical geographical event, and the second issue was the start of the Protestant movement. You brothers probably know that Protestantism, or is that Christian sect who objected to and revolted against the authority of the Pope of Rome, the Catholic Church. In general, in summary, they believe that no human being can stand intermediary between them and Jesus. And they argued that biblical interpretation and biblical reading should be for every single individual to do. In other words, before that, the priests were the only ones who had had copies of the Bible, and they would read and interpret it to the laity or to the common folk. However, they believed that every Christian should himself be able to read his Bible and interpret it and so forth. And they also believed in a literalism of the Bible. And unlike the Catholics, they believed whatever is mentioned in the Bible should be taken literally and not be given figurative or allegorical interpretation. Now, in these ideas, they were influenced by the Muslims. So much so that Martin Luther was accused himself of being a closet Muslim. And that is because the Christians, when they came to the Muslim lands during the Crusades that occurred before this by 2 centuries or 3 centuries, they came into contact with Muslim civilization and Muslims. And they saw that the Muslims had no priestly hierarchy or class. That Muslims had no intermediaries between them and Allah. That Muslims, every Muslim would read the Quran himself. And that Muslims believed in what the Quran said literally, without figuratively interpreting it. And so therefore these ideas were embedded in the psyche of the European when he returned back after the Crusades. And therefore a religious movement, a revolt occurred in Europe, led by Martin Luther. One of Martin Luther's things that occurred with him is that they translated for the first time the Bible out of Latin into what is known as the vernacular, or the languages spoke by the European people. And what was translated was the Old Testament into German and into English. And as a result, Protestantism was spread predominantly in Northern Europe. in Germany and in the United Kingdom, what we call now the UK or England in those days. And what had occurred was that people started to have, it became a religious movement, okay, that was rooted in the Old Testament, which they would now be reading in their vernacular, in their common tongue. Instead of reading it in Latin, they would now read it in English or in German or in whatever. And as a result, when they read this, they saw these prophecies saying that the children of Israel were going to be blessed in the seed of Abraham. And they also felt that because the Messiah had to return among the children of Israel, they thought that in order to bring back the Messiah, they had to bring the Jew into the Holy Land. And so therefore, Christian-Jewish relations changed for the first time in history. Rather than Christians putting the Jews to the sword, as they did in the Catholics, the Christians started to support the Jews. And as a result, it is considered that, for instance, Napoleon, when he attacked the Islamic world and conquered Egypt in 1798, one of his main aims, besides conquering Egypt and so forth in order to, but one of his main aims was to take Palestine in order to give it to the Jews. And likewise, one of his aims was, of course, most of you might not know, that he attempted to go to Medina to take the Prophet's body out of his grave and put it in the Louvre Museum in Paris. So, Napoleon was, one of his aims was to let the Jews come into Palestine. And so therefore, Christian-Jewish relations started to improve slowly and slowly. And the Jews, seeing this, decided to take advantage of this. And so they started to support Protestantism. Because the Jews, when they were under Catholic rule, were forced to live in ghettos, they were put to the sword, they were persecuted. But now the Christians are coming, a Christian sect says that, look, we need to be kind to the Jews, and we need to take care of them and move them to Palestine so the Messiah can come back. And also the enmity that occurred between the Christians fighting themselves, the Jews found in this a respite. Because now the Christian was putting sword against Christian, instead of putting the sword against the Jew. And so therefore the Jews started to support the Protestant movement with all their money and their machinations, their plotting. And many Jews entered into this movement and helped it spread. And slowly these ideas spread from Protestantism until it reached the other Christian sects. And as a result, Europe in the centuries following the fall of Muslim Spain, in the 16th and 17th centuries, witnessed a sectarian strife of killing between Protestant and Catholic, which the vestiges of this war is still witnessed in the end of Europe, in the border, the final outer extreme of Europe, where in Ireland. You see, this battle of Catholic against Protestant in the heart of Europe came to an end, right? But the vestiges of this battle is still at the periphery of Europe, in Northern Ireland. So as a result, the Protestants, being slaughtered by the Catholics, were forced to flee. And where did they decide to flee to? The New World. And they came to the New World with a religious belief rooted in the Old Testament. And that's why the first Americans, Europeans to come to the United States were known as who? The Pilgrims. What was the other name for them? They're called because of the P also. Huh? Protestants or Protestants, I know. Puritans. Right? The Puritans, the strong Christians, And if you see any of those movies or documentaries or something like this, they came in there, Massachusetts, right? Most liberal state now in the United States, 400 years ago was the most severely religious state in the United States, most severely religious area where they applied the law of Moses and so forth. So, this new religious thing, and they thought that the Christians, the Protestants, when they came from England and from Germany into North America, they thought that their coming to North America was like the children of Israel leaving the persecution of Moses and going to the Holy Land. So when they came to America, to this wilderness, they started to name the cities of America that they lived and they formed according to names of biblical cities. And that's why, for instance, myself and Brother Idris, we live maybe about 20 or 30 miles from Damascus. Not Damascus, Syria, but Damascus, Maryland. And so forth. Throughout the United States, you find cities and places mentioned which are taken from biblical names, because this is what they did when they were forming these cities. And they thought of themselves like the children of Israel. In fact, it was even considered when they formed the United States of America, when they were debating, when they revolted against the British crown, They thought, what should we call this country? Before they decided to settle in the United States of America, an idea was put forward to call it New Israel. See, it's a reflection of this biblical belief. And thus, America was established, as Carter said in the speech that I quoted, or that excerpt of the speech, upon this Protestant biblical foundation, Old Testament foundation. And now you can understand why, if you understand this, how America is rooted in the Old Testament. How come America, with all its might and its wealth, stands in to support the Jews now in Israel, and stands prepared to receive the Antichrist, or the Messiah who they expect will appear in the year 2000. And as a result of this, throughout American history you find people calling to Jews gathering in Israel and Palestine. Among these was a person named William Eugene Blackstone, who was born in the year 1841. I mean, almost 107 years before the foundation of the State of Israel. And he wasn't a Jew, but he was a Methodist Christian, and he wrote a book called Jesus is Coming. Jesus is Coming. This book was translated into 48 languages, including Hebrew, and sold over 1 million copies. In fact, in the last century, it was the most widely read book in the West, after, like, the Bible. And in this book, his idea, if we were to summarize, is about 100 pages, that we must gather all the children of Israel all the Jews to the children to Palestine to prepare for the Messiah, because he was born in 1841, and he thought in the year 1900 Jesus was going to come. So we have to prepare for this. And likewise, what he did was he got a petition together, where it was signed by 413 prominent Americans, congressmen, judges, lawyers, and so forth, and they were presented to Benjamin Harrison, who was the president at that time, petitioning him to use his good offices and influence, what they said, to achieve Jewish claims to Palestine. And this was given to Benjamin Harrison in the year 1891. Okay. At this time in England, the other Protestant, bastion, we found that during Victorian rule, Queen Victoria's rule, the British established something called the Palestine Exploration Fund. And this Palestine Exploration Fund, or the PEF in short, the patron of it was the Archbishop of Canterbury, who, as you all know, is the leading bishop of Protestant British tradition. And the purpose of this fund was to discover the Promised Land and its boundaries and landmarks in the Torah. And then we find at the turn of the century, we come to the next race, or next individual, prominent individual, is Balfour, who his niece in his bibliography, or in his biography, mentioned that he had a faith deeply rooted in the Torah, and that he would read the Bible on a daily basis and believed in it literally. And it was a result of this faith of his that he composed the Balfour Declaration, allowing the Jews, or giving them a right to live establish a homeland in Palestine. And at the same time, during Balfour's time, you had the Prime Minister of England at the turn of the century was Lloyd George, who calls himself a self-confessed Zionist. Here he's calling himself a Zionist. And he proclaimed his belief that it was necessary for the Jews to gather into Palestine in order for the Messiah to come back. And that's why at the beginning of the century, the British were the ones who were assisting the Jews to gather into Palestine. It was the British who took Palestine, and it was the British who declared the Balfour Declaration, and it was the British who set up the Jews in Palestine. And there are other evidences, which are too many to quote at this time. A book which was written by a lady called Regina Sharif, and was printed here in the United Kingdom in London. It's called Non-Jewish Zionism. She covers 4 centuries, showing through the poetry and the writings, the intellectual writings of Christian Europe, supporting the idea, and Regina Sharif is not a Muslim, I mean her name is, she's a Christian, I think a Palestinian Christian, supporting that how the Christians believed it was necessary for the Jews to be in Palestine in order for the Messiah to come, and they were working on this from the 14th and 15th and 16th century until they finally were able to achieve it in this century. Indeed, Chaim Weizmann, the first Jewish Prime Minister, said that from the main reasons the Jews were able to win the Balfour Declaration from England to establish a national Jewish homeland was the influence of the Torah on British sentiment, on the common Britisher. And at this time we find also in America when the British were doing this, the American president was Woodrow Wilson, who we talked about earlier. We mentioned him earlier. When Wilson had the opportunity, came to the League of Nations to establish a homeland for the Jews in Israel, he said, and I quote, "To think that I, the son of the Mass," meaning the Mass is the church, the son of the church, should be able to restore the Holy Land to its people. He thought this was a divine mission for him, that he was able to restore the Holy Land to its people, meaning the Jews. And he was a Presbyterian, and the word Mass is a Presbyterian term used for the church. And about Wilson, Regina Sharif mentions that it was his commitment to Zionism was very deep, and this was due to his Christian Zionist ideology, to the degree that he was so blinded by his Christian fanatical beliefs to the moral, political, and religious consequences of allowing the Jews to be in Palestine. In fact, among the ludicrous oddities is that President Wilson, when asked one time at the White House how many Jews he thought were in the world, he said 100 million Jews. And he said it's a shame that there's 100 million people who wouldn't have their own country. Even though the Jews at that time, their numbers didn't surpass 10 million. But you see how the Jews were able to indoctrinate them. Because the message in the Bible says that their numbers will be as the dust of the earth. So here you have the president of the most educated nation of the world thinking there are 100 million Jews in the world who don't have a country when their numbers weren't even more than 10 million. Also during this time, right after World War I, you had the chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee in the United States Congress, an individual by the name of Henry Cabot Lodge, who in 1922, during a speech in Boston, he made the following remarks. In 1922, he says, "It seems to me that it's entirely becoming," and this is very good, "and commendable that the Jewish people in all portions of the world should desire to have a national home for such members of their race as wish to return to the country which was the cradle of their race and where they lived and labored for several thousand years." In other words, he's saying it's very good to see that the Jews have their national home, which they were for 1,000 years before. Then he says this, and this is the important point, "I never should accept in patience the thought that Jerusalem and Palestine should be under the control of the Mohammedans," meaning the Muslims. 16 years before the creation of Israel, Henry Cabot Lodge, the head of the Foreign Relations Committee of the United States Congress, said, "I cannot accept the idea that Jerusalem and Palestine is going to remain in the control of the Muslims." Because, after World War I, right, when he's speaking after World War I, 6 years or 4 years after World War I, Palestine was taken from the control of the Ottoman Muslims, right, and put under British control, mandate. So he's saying, but I cannot see it ever. I cannot have myself stand to bear to see it, that Palestine returns back to the Muslims and Jerusalem in particular. This is to show us that the Christians believed before the Jews that the Jews should be in Palestine. In fact, when Theodor Herzl first came up with the idea that the Jews should go to Palestine, most of the Jews in the world rejected the idea. Because many Jews believe, and you will find many Orthodox Jewish rabbis in America and elsewhere, believe that this is an indication of their end. That they know that from their scriptures, that once the Jews all gather in Palestine, the Messiah will come and they'll be slaughtered and they will come to their end. So for this reason, some Orthodox Jews do not want to see the state of Israel, and they are against it. Because they see this as an indication of that their end has come close. And one of the results of this Protestant religion was just like they had a revival when it first started 500 years ago, and they went to America and so forth, that now it's experiencing a Christian revival. It is a revival, and it's a fundamentalism. And it's a fundamentalism which is rooted in the Bible. We know that, for instance, it is said, according to statistics like the Gallup poll, the Gallup Institute says that America, after Ireland, is the most religiously Christian nation. Indeed, 94% of all Americans are said to believe in God, according to their doctrines, and 71% of all Americans believe in life after death. In 1970, 131 million Americans were church members. In 1980, it was 135. But however, by 1982, it became 139.6 million. So you can see in 2 years, while from 70 to 80, church increased 4 million people. And of course, the American population increased. That's probably a natural increase. But however, the 2 years that followed, it jumped 4 million. And for instance, we know that in 1982, Americans donated $60 billion to the church. Most Muslim countries don't have $60 billion as their gross national product. Saudi Arabia is probably one of the richest Muslim countries, not the richest Muslim country. Their gross national product is not more than $45 or $50 billion. That's a whole nation. But yet Christians in America donated to their churches $60 billion in 1982. What is that money compared to the national wealth of the poorer Muslim countries like Chad, Niger, Bangladesh, and so forth? One might imagine. In fact, and as a result, we find the Christian missionaries that in 1989, total Christian contribution for missionary activity alone was $151 billion. And this is reported by the International Bulletin of Missionary Research. And at the end of my trip here in the United Kingdom, there's going to be a lecture, myself and Brother Idris, regarding Christian activities to make the Muslims, evangelization of the Islamic world, I think is what he titled it. How many schools do you find, Christian schools in the United States? In 1981 and 1982, it is reported that there were 1,948 higher studies institutions for Christian studies. In 1954, there were only 123 Christian schools, day schools in the United States. By 1980, it was more than 18,000. Think of that. In 1954, 123 Christian day schools. By 1980, it occurred how much? More than 18,000 in the United States. This is all indications of a religious revival in America, a Christian fundamentalism. Also, for instance, we know that the famous universities in the United States were all founded upon Christian fundamentalist or Christian Protestant bases like Harvard, Yale, and other universities. Today, Christian fundamentalists have more than 20,000 schools where millions of students study. However, the Islamic University of Medina, probably one of the few Islamic institutions we have in the Islamic world, has no more than 1,000 or 2,000 students in the student body. In all of Saudi Arabia, there's only maybe 3 or 4 Islamic universities. I would imagine that in the whole Islamic world, in fact, I think I read one time that the whole Islamic world, the total amount of Islamic universities we have in the Islamic world is no more than 100 universities. And yet, in the United States, they have more than 20,000 schools of different levels, where millions of students study. Also, we know that the presidents of the United States, one of the indications of their religious revival is that the presidents of the United States, we find them have a very deep religious belief. Jimmy Carter, until today, is a traveling missionary. Today you find him in Afghanistan and Pakistan. Tomorrow you find him in Sudan and Ethiopia and Somalia. The next day he's in Bosnia, going all over the world, spreading Christian ideas and spreading the political agenda of the United States of America. Likewise, Ronald Reagan, as we said, who came after Carter, mentioned that on more than 11 occasions he believed in the biblical prophecies in Armageddon. Publicly, 11 occasions he declared that. Bush was an ally of the fundamentalists, even though he himself might have not held those ideas, but did it out of hypocrisy. And likewise, we know that Clinton is this very strong, Christian and has his Christian facade to him. In 1984, the amounts of religious books that were sold in the United States were more than 1/3 of the total gross sales of the entire commercial book market. In other words, more than 1/3 of all the books sold in the United States were religious books in 1984. And it's estimated the value of these books were equal to $1 billion, which were bought by 37 million buyers. I don't think now you can find in any Islamic world 37 million buyers for Islamic books to that degree. Also, we know, for instance, in the United States, what they call the electric church, or the evangelical preachers of the likes of, in the past, like Jimmy Swaggart and Jim Baker, and today you find Jerry Falwell and others. It is said that 47% of all Americans tune in at least once a week to watch fundamentalist programs in 1980. One new religious radio station is being established every week in America, and one new religious television station every month. And this statistic was taken in 1978. What must it be now in close to 1998, 20 years later? And in fact, we know that, for instance, one of the organizations which are doing the missionary work in the Islamic world reach now more than 60 60 countries of the world through satellite broadcasts, where millions and millions of people, hundreds of millions of people watch their programs. The Association of National Religious Broadcasters, when they were founded in 1944 in the United States, they only had 49 stations. But by 1980, it was 800 stations, which produced 1,000 different religious programming. They had 1,000 religious stations. They had. It is said that the two major Christian fundamentalist stars, Jerry Falwell and Pat Robertson, take in every year more money than the Republican and Democratic parties combined. The two major political parties. So you might imagine two church leaders, two fundamentalist leaders in the United States, bring in more money into their churches than the two major political parties in the United States, the Democrats and the Republicans. Which is similar to, I guess, Labor and what? Lecutre, what's in English? Labor and Conservative or Tory or whatever. And so therefore, this American fundamentalist movement is considered one of the major political phenomena of the 20th century. And it is said now that the followers of American fundamentalism in the United States reach between 40 to 80 million people. And for those of us in the United States, like myself and Brother Idris, we saw that in the last congressional elections in 1995, how the Christians, or 1994, how the Christians fundamentalist coalition were able to sweep Congress and put a conservative leadership in Congress for the first time in 40 years. And how they're opposed now to, they have a great influence now in the agenda for the next coming presidential elections. In fact, one sociologist studying from the United Kingdom, studying the phenomena of American fundamentalists, says that given their following and their money and their growth, that this trend of thought should last for at least 500 more years. Because of the power. I mean, we saw the communists, right? Communists, how long did they last? They lasted about, 100 years, and it just came to an end. But this British sociologist saying, given the way American fundamentalism is growing, and the power they have, and the wealth, that as an idea, as a religion, as a sect, it should last for at least 500 more years. You might imagine what type of power we're talking about. Okay, let us see. So, and one of the reasons for the spread of American fundamentalism is the appearance of AIDS. America was a very sexually loose society after the 60s and in the 70s. And Americans occurred what was known as the sexual revolution. And it was passé to jump into bed with one partner and then the other, and then jump the next moment with another partner, or whatever sort of sexual perversion they engaged into. However, though, with the appearance of AIDS, this was one of the major causes, this disease that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, plague Allah struck them with, one of the major causes for the return to the people. Because what had happened was that people saw this as a sign, and people started to then question their moral decay. And as Nixon said, it's important that they have to reinvigorate and rediscover their faith. And so one of the major reasons for the return of American fundamentalism in the last 15 and 20 years is the decay of American society and the loss of the mores of the society through the sexual revolution and elsewhere, and other things. What is interesting to know is that concerning the American fundamentalist movement is that the Organization of Islamic Broadcasting in Jeddah, this is an organization, did a study concerning evangelical broadcasting in the Islamic world. And they found in their study that there are 38 television stations, 66 cable networks, 1,400 radio stations. Among these are 4 television services with the annual budget of each one of them exceeding $50 million just to make dawah, Christian dawah to the Muslims. It is estimated that in 1985, half of all Christians use satellites, Christian broadcasting. This means that they are able to reach all corners of the earth. In fact, regarding cinema, the Christians have prepared $100 million to prepare movies which they called under the title the Genesis Project. And the idea was to produce 15 films taken from Genesis and 18 films taken from the Gospel of Luke. And in these programs, one of the things which they produced was called, it's called the Jesus movie. What was it called? Jesus? No, that's called, it's called the Jesus movie or something like that. And this movie has been shown in about 20 Islamic countries. And they've translated it into over 50 languages. It's just about the life, the seerah of Jesus, alayhi salam, but from a Christian perspective. And they have distributed over 100 million video tapes of this in the Islamic world. They broadcast it publicly in Egypt, in Pakistan, in Iraq, on government television and elsewhere in the Islamic world. In the new Central Asian countries of Kazakhstan and so forth, one of their first aims is to put this movie, the Jesus movie, on public television in order to influence the minds of the Muslims. What do these programs state? We can take an example from something said by Jimmy Swaggart, where he said in one of his programs, "I feel that America is tied with the spiritual umbilical cord to Israel. These ties go back long before the founding of the United States of America. The Judeo-Christian concept goes all the way back to Abraham and God's promise to Abraham, which I believe also included America. Because God still says, I will bless those that bless Israel, and I will curse those that curse Israel. Of course, the Bible says, I will bless those that bless Abraham. But he's saying to the people, I will bless those that bless Israel." You see how they interpret it for their own beliefs. And thank God, the United States of America still stands supreme today. And I firmly believe that this is because we stood behind Israel, and I pray God we always will stand behind Israel. The meaning of his words is that America's blessings and America's strength comes because it stands behind Israel. So once America leaves Israel, it means America will collapse. This is what they believe. And this is why you find that the Christian stars of Christian fundamentalism are very supportive of Israel. For instance, Jerry Falwell, the head of an organization which was called the Moral Majority, which he disbanded a few years ago, he has said that America is a Judeo-Christian republic. And he has said that to stand against Israel is to stand against God. And he talks always in his programs about God's promise to Abraham 4,000 years ago, that I will bless them that bless thee and curse him that curseth thee. And he says from a theological perspective, America should be without hesitation giving total financial and military support to the state of Israel. He also thought that when Israel was established in 1948, this was the key to the prophecies of the Torah, and a sign of God's faithfulness and blessing to his chosen people. He also has a university called Liberty University, where he says by the year 2000 he will have 50,000 students studying from a number of countries around the world the divinities from a Jewish perspective. And he has said that Genesis indicates the boundaries of Israel will stretch from the river Euphrates on the east to west of the Nile River. The promised land would encompass portions of present-day Iraq, Syria, Turkey, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, Sudan, all of Lebanon, Jordan, and Kuwait. This is what he says. This is all belongs to the Jews, all these lands. Likewise, he attacks the Arabs, and he says that the Arabs are an accursed race because they are from the people of Canaan, and he says there's no room for the Arab in America. And also we find Pat Robertson, who has tried to become, on occasion, once or twice, has tried to reach for the Republican nomination as President of the United States. He has his Christian broadcast network, which broadcasts 24 hours during the day, and among his programs is the 700 Club. And he has also said the rebirth of Israel is the only indication that the final countdown for the world has begun. And he calls the Arabs God's enemies. And he says God will establish, he said there's no room for justice with the Palestinians so long as it's God's will to establish Israel and demarcate its borders. One of the things he's done is that he has opened up a station which is known as the Middle East Broadcasting Station. Now, it previously used to be called Star of Hope. And when it first opened up, he said this statement. He said, because it broadcasts to the Muslim land. It broadcasts to Syria, Iraq, Turkey, Egypt, and Saudi Arabia. And in which Pat Robertson said, and in the first broadcast day, the Quran and Muslim teachings do not meet the deepest needs of the human heart. These are times of crises, and Islam stands on the divided doctrine, meaning that Islam, he expects, will fall and collapse. Robertson goes on to say, while there are deeply ingrained prejudices, there is a new openness to the gospel message, if only if it could be available by television. And to show his power, that in 1985, he assisted, it was when the Americans took the Jews out of Ethiopia, the Flassa Jews, they did it on Pat Robertson's airplane. And Pat Robertson, with the CIA, assisted the Jews, and this was widely reported in the New York Times, the Washington Post, and elsewhere, to assist them. The Americans did it, and Bush took Robertson along. He was at that time vice president, and they went along to do it. Likewise, we have a person named George Otis, which we will talk about in our evangelical lecture. At one time, he ran an organization called High Adventure Ministry, and now he runs an organization called the Sentinel Group. And he has said that he believes literally the gospel, the Bible, is the word of God, and that Israel is the precursor for the second coming of the Messiah, and that he says in one of his advertisements, we are limited to the security of Israel. We believe that all of the Holy Land is an inalienable possession of the Jewish people. And we believe that the establishment of modern Israel is an undeniable fulfillment of biblical prophecy, the herald of the coming Messiah. Likewise, we had a person in the United States who in the 80s called Mike Evans. He's a Jew who became a Christian, and he ran an hour-long special called Israel, America's Key to Survival. In other words, America will not survive unless it supports Israel. And he also came about with a proclamation of support where he called the American people to come to the support of America's best friend by signing a proclamation of blessing to Israel, for Israel, because God distinctly told him to produce this television special. In other words, this television special that he had is wahi from Allah to him. This wahi that he received from Allah, that he says, was aired on 50 stations and was seen by tens of millions of Americans, Europeans, and even Latin Americans. In his proclamation, he had over 1 million people sign it, and it was then given to the American president and to the Israeli prime minister. Another group in the United States, a very dangerous group, is called the International Christian Embassy. This is probably considered the most dangerous group, one of the most dangerous groups in the world. Basically, they said that God has required them to establish an embassy for them. They had a conference where in Basel, Switzerland, which was the place that Theodore Herzl had the first Zionist conference. And in this conference, they came out with a declaration of support for the state of Israel. It's probably too lengthy. We don't have enough time to go into this, but it's a very important thing. It shows the mentality of these Christian fundamentalists towards this. It's interesting that we find that the Christian fundamentalists believe that the state of Israel is a sign of the coming of the Messiah. Interestingly, that Imam Ibn al-Qayyim, in his refutation of Christianity and Judaism 750 years ago approximately, when he wrote it, he said that before the day of judgment, the Jews will have a state and an army. And this is because they are the soldiers and supporters of the Antichrist, the Dajjal. And they will have a state of an army which they will fight the Muslims with, and then finally Isa will come back and defeat the Jews, and the Muslims will defeat the Jews, and the hadith about the rock and stone and tree, which you are aware of. What is the true promise that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has given? We can discuss that for some time, a few moments. We know that in every single prayer we say, اهدنا الصراط المستقيم صراط الذين أنعمت عليهم غير المغضوب عليهم ولا الضالين. Guide us to the straight path, the path of those who you have blessed, not those who you have angered, nor those who are astray. Those you are angered with are the Jews. Those who are astray are the Christians, as the Prophet ﷺ identified. And so therefore, in every single prayer, in every single time you read Surah Al-Fatiha, is a refutation against the Jews and the Christians, and a refutation against the peace process, whether they like it or not. In fact, one of the stories, well-known stories that occurred during the Gulf War, was that when some scholars in Saudi Arabia started to speak out against the Christians, it was said that they shouldn't, the government said, we don't want you to attack the Christians on the pulpits, anymore, because these are our guests and they've come to defend us and so forth and so on. So one of the scholars in Qasim said to one prince, he said, okay, I guess you don't want us to read Surah Al-Fatiha then, because Surah Al-Fatiha has a refutation of the Jews and Christians, and so therefore by implication we're not supposed to read it. So the prince said, okay, no, just don't interpret it to the people. So you see, this is the point, that in every single salah we are making a declaration against it. Now, after the summit of the peacemakers that occurred just 2 weeks ago, President Bill Clinton went to Israel, and while he was there, he went to visit the graves of those Jews who died in the bus, okay? And one of the things he said was, in his press conference when he arrived, standing next to Shimon Peres, the Israeli prime minister, was he said, I wish I could get into the heart of every single one of those young men. and take out these ideas that they have, these fanatical, zealous ideas or words to that effect, and this idea of the coming of the world, end of the world, and so forth. In other words, he's saying that he wants to change the belief of the youth of the Muslims, so they no longer consider the Jews to be their enemies. The changing of our beliefs and our identity. We know that, for instance, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has given a promise to the Prophet Abraham. We know this from the Quran. And we also know that the promise was extended to the descendants of the Prophet Abraham through the Prophet Ismail alayhi salam, where in which the Prophet has said in a hadith reported by Ahmad al-Tirmidhi, and Tirmidhi declaring the hadith to be sahih, that Allah chose Ismail from the children of Abraham, and then He chose from Ismail's descendants the tribe of Kanana, and from Kanana He chose the Quraysh, and from Quraysh He chose the Banu Hashim, the children of Hashim, and He chose me from the children of Hashim, meaning the Prophet ﷺ. And likewise, we know what Allah's promise is concerning the Jews. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us in Surah Al-Isra, and when your Lord proclaimed that He would send forth against the Jews until the day of resurrection those who would afflict them with evil chastisement. This is the promise of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala towards the Jews, that He would punish them with people until the day of judgment. Surely your Lord is swift in retribution, and surely He is all forgiving, all merciful. This is from Surah Al-A'raf, as I said. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has also said that abasement shall be pitched on the Jews wherever they are found, except when they are in a bond from Allah and a bond from the people. And they have incurred the anger from Allah, and poverty shall be pitched on them. The Jews are always in a state of abasement unless somebody props them up. And that's why only when the British propped them up, they were able to come to Palestine. And only when the Americans propped them up, they're able to stay there. But it is Allah's divine decree that whoever supports the Jew will get the punishment which is given to the Jew. And that's why when the British supported the Jews and established them in the lands of the Muslims, Allah struck the British with what? Poverty and abasement. And so therefore that empire, which they said the sun would never set upon, was reduced to these islands, and their nose is bloodied by a bunch of gangs from Northern Ireland, unable to do something. And the poverty which you see now in the United Kingdom, I think all of you probably see and sense it and maybe taste it even. I mean, you can see how this city, right, of London, which was the jewel of the world maybe 100 years ago, it looks like almost a state of disrepair. This is Allah's divine punishment for them supporting the Jews. And likewise, what is happening to America now, from its poverty and its problems, is part of Allah's divine punishment because the Americans supported the Jews. Because Allah in His Quran says that He will strike the Jews with humiliation and abasement and poverty. And so whoever supports them gets it. And when these Arab leaders support the Jews and sit in these peace conferences with them, Allah will strike them as He has struck them, and will continue to strike them with abasement and poverty. And what is happening to America is a result of that. Likewise, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us in Surah Al-Isra that when the time came for the second promise came to pass, we sent against you our servants to discountenance you, meaning to disfigure you, and to enter in the temple as the previous people entered it the first time, and to destroy you utterly what you ascended to. Your Lord may well have mercy upon you, but if you return for a third time, we shall punish you too. And this is what happened. The Jews were in the temple, and then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala punished them when they became disobedient with the Babylonian pagan king. And when the Jews were again brought back out of captivity, when Cyrus, the Persian king, took them out of captivity and took them from Babylon and put them back into Palestine, when they disbelieved into Jesus alayhi salam, Allah struck them with the Roman pagans. At that time the Romans were idol worshippers. They had to become Christians, and they burnt the temples. And then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, but if you return, we will return. Now they have returned. Are they obeying Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? Are they believing in His prophets? Do they believe in Jesus now? Do they believe in the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam? Do they apply the laws of the Torah or the Quran? No. So then Allah's punishment will come to them again. However, this time the punishment will be the final punishment, because it will be, as the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam said that the last hour will not be established till you fight the Jews. The Jews will flee and hide behind stones and trees, and on that day the stone and tree will speak, O Muslim, O Abdullah, O worshipper of Allah, there is a Jew behind me, come and kill him. And likewise the Prophet ﷺ has said in a hadith reported by Imam Ahmed, even though the scholars have differed concerning this hadith, some weakening it and some saying that the sanad is hasan, that the Prophet ﷺ said that whoever remains of you from this ummah will fight the Jews at the Jordan River. You will be on its east bank and they on their west. And even if this hadith is da'if, we know that the Prophet ﷺ told us from affirmed hadith in Sahih Muslim and elsewhere that the Muslims, when they fight the final battle, it will be, Jesus will come to them in Damascus. And that Jesus alayhi salam will kill a Dajjal at the gates of Lod, or Lud in Arabic, which is a city in Israel today, not so far from Jerusalem. So, even if this hadith in Imam Ahmed that we will be on the east bank of the river and the Jews on the west bank of the river is considered to be weak, as some scholars argue, or other scholars say it's hasan, the other hadith, which are affirmed, indicate that the battle will be there. So this hadith in itself is not going to a thing. And so therefore part of Allah's promise to us is that the Messiah will return amongst us. And that He will kill the king of the Jews, the Dajjal, the Antichrist, at the gates of Lod in Palestine, as I mentioned. And that He will break the cross and eradicate the swine and abolish the jizya. There will be no alternative for the Christians but to become Muslims on that day, or die by the sword and at the hands of Messiah, Jesus the son of Mary, alayhi salam, and those Muslims with him. And you know why? This is a fitting punishment for the Christians, because the Christians for 1500 years have been putting the Muslim to the sword, or for 1400 years, have been putting the Muslims to the sword in the name of Jesus. And so now they're put to the sword by Jesus' sword himself. And this is how Allah's divine retribution comes to them. Because always the punishment is going to come according to the type of sin. This is a divine law. Also among the promises is that the appearance of the Mahdi alayhi salam at the end of time, who will lead the Muslims in the battle against the Christians, and then Isa will come and pursue the battle against the Jews. So this land of the Middle East is unlike what the summit for the peacemakers in the New World Order says is going to be a land of peace. It's not. It's going to be a land of tribulation and warfare and bloodshed until the Day of Judgment. Because only when the Christians are eradicated and the Jews are eradicated from the face of the earth will the blessings of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala come, and there will be no more war on the earth. And the blessings of these ahadith I've spoken about elsewhere, and I wish I had time to mention, but because there's not much time left. However, we should know that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has said to us, O you who believe, Ya ayyuha alladhina amanu, whoever of you turns in apostasy from his religion, know that in his stead Allah will bring a people whom He loves and who love Him, humble towards the believers, stern towards the disbelievers, men who wage jihad in the path of Allah, not fearing to be censured by anyone who censures them. If we forsake jihad at this time, the ummah denies jihad and says that this is no longer because of international law or peace, we will become apostates from our religion. And Allah will bring forth a people who will fight jihad against the Jews and the Christians. And so therefore, it is only for our own salvation that we should return to this. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has told us, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has said in the Quran, Surah Nur, Allah has promised such of you as believe and do righteous deeds that He will surely cause them to succeed the present rulers in earth. Likewise, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has said, for we have written in the scripture, after the remembrance, that the earth shall be the inheritance of my righteous servants. This means, as Ibn al-Qayyim said, the inheritance of Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam and his community. And the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam has said that the mulk, the kingdom, the dominions of his ummah will reach wherever day and night reach. Meaning Islam will come and the Sharia will rule wherever day and night reach. There will come a day when London will be ruled by the Sharia, whether the Christians like that or not. If there is something called London in those days, if there's a city which is inhabited at that time, wherever day and night reach, the Sharia will rule. And of course day and night reaches here as it does throughout the earth. Now, with this in mind, what is the duty for the ummah must do, or before that, if we have a few minutes, what are the aims of this peace process? what are the aims of the New World Order? What are they trying to do now in the Middle East? Let's quickly go to them and mention what does the Ummah have to do in order to counter this. The first thing they want to do is eliminate the Palestinian jihad. They want to eliminate any resistance because the Jews fear first and foremost those Palestinian brothers waging jihad against them. Look, we all understand that the brothers in Palestine, many of them do not have deep knowledge of the Quran and the Sunnah and so forth. But we have to recognize the circumstances which they live. There are no scholars amongst them. They live in occupation. Many of these young men have very limited means of education. They have been living in camps, refugee camps, and so forth, okay? So one cannot expect that these brothers would be all scholars of Islam waging jihad. But the point is that they are motivated by a faith in Islam, irrespective if they might err in some of their judgments and some of their ideas. And so therefore this is what brings fear to the Jews and the Christians. That this thing. And that's why one time the late president of France, François Mitterrand, when the Palestinian Intifada first occurred in 1984 or thereabouts, he said that this presents a threat to the Christians in Europe, the European civilization. How could some boy throwing a rock, as you were saying, present a threat to European civilization? Because it's the consequences that once people return to their religion, and then there will come a time when they start learning their religion, this is what they fear. Even though these people themselves might not be able to achieve all this because of their deficiency in knowledge and their deficiency in religion and their deficiency maybe in material means. Likewise, once they have the general peace between the Arabs and the Jews, they will seek to strangle the Islamic Da'wah and strike at the Islamic movement everywhere throughout the world. As Nixon mentioned, from Morocco to Indonesia. This is exactly what's happened. Since the Gulf War, throughout the Islamic world, Islamic movements have faced unbelievable persecution. And scholars have been put in jail in countries which traditionally were thought of as supporting Islamic Da'wah. And likewise, the execution of Muslims and so forth, the arrest, the stopping of Dawah projects throughout the Islamic world. Now, when they strike at the Islamic movement, let me guarantee you, they do not care which group you're part of. They could care less if you're Salafi, Ikhwani, Tablighi, I mean whatever. When they strike all you young men with beards. That's all they take to the jail. That's all they will be moved. They could care less what is your party affiliation. This is not to say, as I mentioned earlier, that one should not know the difference and should not follow the truth concerning when these groups, they err in a matter, But the point is that we should understand what is their understanding of the issue. To them it is Islam and against the West, or Islam against civilizations, they like to do it. And they have no type, this distinction means nothing to them. Likewise, they strike to remove all Arab military might, which they did in Iraq, and they'll do elsewhere. They want to subjugate the region to Jewish military terror, and American hegemony over the region can be seen. Throughout the Middle East now you find American stations, American troops, American Air Force, American naval, and so forth. Throughout the Middle East, it has become like a big military camp for the American army. The American armies have left Europe just to encamp now in the lands of the Muslim. Likewise, they seek to alter the media programs and education curricula in the Islamic world. Anything which leads towards enmity towards the Jews. Just like they said during the peace process, the first peace conference, Shamir said, we would like you to see in your countries an end to the poisonous preachings against Israel. And after this bombing, recent bombings that they had in Palestine, the Israeli government and the American government demanded from Yasser Arafat to make the people in the masajid, the imams on Salat al-Jum'ah, say that you will not go to paradise if you die in jihad. So that people would not have a motivation to do this. They'll think they're just wasting their life. And likewise you find in the masajid, it's very strange now in the last 4 or 5 years, Islam has been changed. And I gave a topic last summer, maybe some of you remember, the Abrahamic faiths, where I explained how they're changing even the nature of our religion. The idea of tawheed and wala and bara and so forth. And also, for instance, the idea of women in Islam, to Islamic feminism, which they're calling now, which I'll discuss later this week. A complete rewriting of Islam through modernism and so forth. These are not just events which occur haphazardly or without connection, but these are all part of a global plan to destroy Islam. Likewise, they seek to reinforce or enforce Jewish financial and economic control over the Middle East. Now Muslim economies are nothing compared to Jewish economies. And with the peace, the Jews will be able to put their hands on the wealth of the Muslims and waste and destroy the wealth and the money for the future generations. They seek to conquer the region with Jewish and Christian teachings, and we see this now with the spread of missionary work in the Islamic world. Since the Gulf War and the New World Order, Islamic missionary work activity to the Muslim lands have increased exponentially. And they have just come with a new plan called the 1040 window, where they have targeted 100 cities, predominantly Muslim cities, as mentioned in this book, 100 Gateways of the 1040 window, and which we'll discuss, myself and Brother Idris, in a lecture in about a week and a half before we depart. How this is part and parcel of their plan to attack the Islamic world. They seek to morally corrupt the Muslims. You know, Muslims, we have basically one resource left in our hands: the youth of Islam. And they seek to morally corrupt the youth of Islam. Muslim youth who are raised upon rock and roll music, raised upon the lifestyle of McDonald's and Madonna, are not the youth which are going to stand up to Christians and Jews. But they can be used by them to fight to other Muslims. And women, this is the other resource that we have. Corrupt our women. Because when a man goes out and works, the wife is the one there with the child. She provides the child's first sense of identity. And if the mother is, you know, concerned with soap operas, they have soap operas here? So soap operas and so forth, and is concerned with the latest fashion and the latest perfume and the latest trend of cutting one's hair, what type of mother is this going to be? And so therefore they seek to corrupt us morally and culturally. And now with the, you know, with the spread of technology, of communications, you can see how they can corrupt you. I mean, now the satellite dishes, right? You can pick up in Mecca any program which is broadcast in Europe. You can pick up through the internet any sorts of information can be transmitted. Wherever you are, you can be sitting in your house in Mecca or in Medina or in Cairo, and with the internet you can sit and you can receive all that garbage into your home. And so therefore it opens to morally corrupt the people. Likewise, they wanted to give a chance for Jewish intelligence to reach parts which they never seemed to have accessing to before, and to allow them to study the Islamic revival. It's very important for the Jews and the Christians, the Americans and the Europeans to know who are the people giving da'wah. What are they saying? What are the organizations? I guarantee you that all British organizations, all your Muslim clubs and so forth, have big files among British intelligence in this country. And all your leaders of your MSAs and so forth are probably having, you know, files for them. This is part, they have to know this, even though your brothers might not do anything, I mean, but it's important for them to know, I mean, in case you grow and to become a figure. I mean, one day, there might be one of you young men who might become a very prominent figure. And it's important for them to know who you are, the brothers right there, inshallah, who they are before that happens. So what is required of us in this case? Well, some scholars have said that it's required for us, of course, we have to overhaul the whole ummah. I mean, the revival, the repair work we have to do is a complete reform of this ummah. The first thing we need to do is we need to spread aqeedah between the ranks of the ummah, the aqeedah of Ahl Sunnah wal Jama'ah, the Salafi aqeedah. We need to spread this because this is what defines us, Tawheed. We need to know what is our religion, what is our beliefs, and in particular, the aqeedah of al-wala wal-bara. So Muslims know that their allegiance and their love and their affinity is to the fellow Muslims, and their disavowal is to the unbelievers. You know, many brothers might recognize that as a principle on their tongue, but when it comes to practical application, they are more harsh and severe with their fellow Muslims, even those Muslims who might share the same aqeedah with them, say manhaj with them, but might differ with them in a matter or might make a mistake than they are with the Jews and the Christians. Is this the religion of Islam? And so therefore, the first thing they try to do is they try to seek, we need to do is to spread the aqeedah of wala and bara. This is why they strike at this aqeedah through these ideas of the Abrahamic faith, to this idea of humanism, to the idea of secularism, and so forth and so on. The other thing is we must revive the role of our mosques to fight this media and educational blitz that we face. You know, it's very sad that we have to have this lecture in a hall, in a rented hall. But this is because masajid wouldn't want to adopt this lecture, unfortunately, so the brothers were forced to rent a hall for it. This is a crime, that our masajid are not being used to educate and the people. The masjid is the place of the Muslim. And it is the masjid from where we learn our religion, from the message which we discuss our affairs, whether it's the affairs of our community, the affairs of our city, or the affairs of our ummah. And it's the vision that we have. We make the masajid into empty bodies. As you come in, you just say as-salah and leave, and nothing occurs in this. This is not what Islam is about. The first thing the Prophet ﷺ did was he established the masjid. And it was in the masjid that he used to make decisions. He used to be a judge in the masjid when he would make his decision for the hudud, for instance. And it was from the masjid he would send out his armies. And when he used to confine with his companions, he did it in the masjid. And the first school was in the masjid. And so therefore we must revive the masjid. You know, we own the masajid. The Jum'ah khutbah is extremely important. You know, we wait sometimes for these events in order to gather the brothers, but you have every single Friday an opportunity to address the Muslims. And this is a time for education, for enlightening the Muslims. And this is not done just in one area, but it's done throughout the Islamic world, in every single city and town and village. And so therefore the third thing we must do is that we must unify the ranks of Ahl Sunnah wal Jama'ah. Those people who say they follow Ahl Sunnah wal Jama'ah, they follow the way of the Salaf al-Salih, must be unified. They cannot remain in hundreds and hundreds and tens of different parties and so forth. That is not acceptable. And this is the first step to uniting the whole ummah upon the way of the Salaf. Because if the people of the Salaf, who attribute themselves to the Salaf, and the people who attribute themselves to Ahl Sunnah wal Jama'ah are ununified and are in disunity initially amongst themselves, how can we expect the whole ummah to unify? Once they unify, then the other parts of the ummah will come and unify upon the way of the Salaf. And for this reason, it's important that we come together on practical da'wah plans. You know, when we want to unify the ummah, we don't unify the ummah by just saying, okay, unity, unity, unity. That doesn't do much. But by having practical da'wah plans, practical da'wah work. The fourth matter is that we must establish Islamic financial institutions so we have economic independence from the kuffar. You know, it's very sad that a large number of the brothers, and I say this, you know, with all my love and respect to my brothers, a large number of the brothers here in London receive some sort of financial aid from the unbelievers. I know that this is a socialist country, and the economic system of this country sort of encourages this type of lifestyle. You know, I mean, this couldn't exist in America because it doesn't just exist in America. They don't have council homes, for instance, and so forth. But in England, it does, because it's basically based upon a socialist economy. However, this type of lifestyle is detrimental. Muslim men must be able to find work and employment where they can get their self-dignity and support themselves and their families and then support their religion. And so therefore we must establish Muslim businesses, Muslim economic institutions in order to do that. And of course when we're talking on the scale of an ummah, Muslims need these type of economic institutions. They're Muslims in ummah. And many of you brothers might have unique opportunities due to the positions that you have now, being raised and educated in the West, to go back to your initial countries that you came from and establish big Islamic institutions, economic institutions, where you can empower Muslims in their villages and so forth. And so therefore a Muslim youth should, you know, look beyond and put a high standard for himself and not always, you know, look at a low level. Also, we must be incumbent of the changes being made to our religion, changes in ideas. Who are introducing these ideas? What is the agenda between these new ideas? Whether it's the feminism, whether it's the Abrahamic faith, whether it's modernistic interpretations of the Quran and Sunnah, whatever it might be. We must also link current events to the Quran and the Sunnah and the Aqeedah of Wala and Bara. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, when He sends the Quran down to the Prophet sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, it was revealed concerning specific instances. When Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala revealed certain verses concerning the Jews and the Christians, concerning Wala and Bara, the companions knew what it was talking about because these occurred during certain incidents which occurred, Allah revealed verses. And so therefore, when we are not able to take those verses in the Quran or the Hadith and link it to the reality which we live in, the current circumstances, then we fail to understand the Quran. We must be able to link the Quran to our lives. The Quran must be a living entity in us. Likewise, we must spread hope of Allah's true promise. The Ummah should not be one of despair. Many times Muslims despair. They say, oh, what's happening? Bosnia, Palestine, Kashmir, Iraq, Philippines, so on and so on, and they become despaired. And so therefore, as a result of despair, they just blow up, and they like to do stuff like a demonstration for one day. So it's like, like when you shake up a Pepsi bottle, right? And it has all that pressure, release it, it foams out, but then it comes back down again. That's not what we need in this ummah. We don't need a valve to release the pressure when it reaches a certain thing. And this is in fact one of the ideas of the kuffar, that when the pressure gets high, they allow the Muslims to release that tension in order so they can go back to fall asleep again. But what we need is we need to work with wisdom, with knowledge, to revive this ummah. It's also incumbent upon us to spread Islam in the West, and in particular in America. The point is that the way of the people of the Sunnah, Ahl Sunnah wal Jama'ah, is that we fight one qadr with another qadr. This is from our aqidah. When Allah decrees for you illness, you fight it with another qadr, which is medicine. And you say in your dua and qunut, oh Allah, I seek refuge from your anger through your mercy. And I seek refuge from you with you. This is from Allah, from the aqidah of qadr. And so likewise, we fight them by putting them as Muslims. And this is a way, because if these people, if you imagine now, if Britain was 50% Muslim, would they be able to have stopped the Muslims in supporting the brethren in Bosnia, like they did in the last conflict? Of course not. But Muslims doesn't mean just Sufi Muslims, the Muslims in the tongue who don't understand anything. Muslims mean Muslims according to the Quran and the Sunnah, Muslim men and women who have the correct belief and also have the correct conduct and behavior and morals. Likewise, we must stand fully with our brothers in Palestine. We must not let this issue of Palestine die. It's incumbent that at least once in a while we give a khutbah in our university. We give a talk to remind the Muslims that this issue, even if the people make peace, will not end until the day of judgment when we face the Christians and Jews on the battlefield. This issue must remain alive in our hearts if the issue is put asleep by world powers. We must never allow this issue to die. Likewise, to support there are many charitable organizations in Palestine. We need to support them with our money. We need to have collections for these brothers and support them, and especially those organizations which are following the way of Ahl Sunnah wal Jama'ah, are very close to the truth. We must support them in Palestine. Through dawah, through money, anything you can do. This must be done. Likewise, for the Muslim countries, Muslims, and really wealthy Muslims, they must withdraw the wealth and deposits from the banks of the Europeans and the Americans. The kuffar live on our money. The Muslim countries like in the Gulf and Saudi Arabia deposit billions of dollars in these banks. And it's with these billions of dollars that they fight us with. And it is at the same time you find millions of Muslims dying from hunger, displacement, war. So we must take this money. Of course, we don't have the ability to do that because we're not in charge of these countries, but the ummah, it's its responsibility to start depositing the money in the banks of the kuffar and to spend the money of the ummah upon the needs of this ummah. And at the same time, it's a requirement of the ummah to save the money for the future generations. Because if we keep it this way, the Jews and Christians will gobble up all our money under the name of the peace process. Our last thing is that the Muslims must, fight a certain mental attitude, that of luxury, waste, and void. Muslims are very luxurious in their lifestyles. We always want the finer things of life. And we're also very wasteful. And also we have a void in our lives. Even those brothers who identify themselves with Ahl Sunnah wal Jama'ah, with the Salafi way, have a void in their lives. They really don't know what they're doing. They're just sort of moving along day by day, and the days and the months and the years go on. They have no purpose. Just sort of moving along. We must stop this. We are now, we must save our energies and not waste our time. And every single cent must be not put except to the right use. Because we face an enemy of such large proportions. And this battle is not a battle which we face now, which is like a battle for a piece of land, that if we lose that land. No, this is a battle for existence or extermination. And therefore, the battle will result in a victor and a vanquished. And so therefore we must use all our resources and energies for this ummah. You know, every single Muslim youth must think of himself as a soldier in an army. It doesn't mean that you have a gun in your hand and you're going to do something crazy, but it means that you have a purpose in your life. And you have a role to fulfill in your ummah. And you see yourself fulfilling that role. Not that you're just sort of carrying on day by day, month by month, year by year, engaging in a lot of useless discussion concerning a lot of matters which really, will bring you no benefit, neither in your religion nor in your hereafter. And I think that this is, the Dawah Salafiyah. This is not Dawah Salafiyah. This is not the way of Ahl Sunnah wal Jama'ah. This is not the meaning of being a Muslim man. Okay? It's brothers need to realize that they have left the age of being kids. Right? Most of you brothers now are passing from that age. And for those who will listen to this by way of tape or by cassette, you brothers have left the age of being kids where you are carefree and so forth. That's this type of period we all go through. Where you're 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, 21, whatever. You're sort of like no attachments, no responsibilities, you're in school, whatever, you're sort of carefree. But, this has to come to an end. And you must become adults and you must become men and women and face the responsibilities that you have to yourself, to your families, to your communities, and to your ummah. And in the end we should know, without doubt, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala prevails in His purpose, even though most people do not know. And that victory will come to this ummah, whether disbelievers like that or not. As Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, He is the one who sent His Prophet with guidance in the true religion, to manifest it, to uplift it over all ways of life, even if the disbelievers find that adverse. And with that I conclude my lecture. I apologize for the haste we went through. There was a lot of material we covered. And I hope at least you got a general idea of what I'd want to discuss. أقول قولي هذا واستغفر الله لي ولكم سبحانك اللهم وبحمدك أشهد أن لا إله إلا أنت أستغفرك وأتوب إليك. And so that was your grace.
Jazakallah for this very informative and instructive lecture. We now have approximately, in reality, approximately about 7 minutes, but inshallah for really for the benefit of all of you, I'm going to, if it's okay with all of you, to possibly extend that a bit. Because I know a lot of brothers and sisters, of course, have a lot of questions. We only have a few of you that were written during the first session. So, if it's okay with all of you, inshallah, that we extend the question and answer period a bit for possibly another 15. Maghrib is what? Does anybody know what time Maghrib is? 6:20? Okay.
So until Adhan.
If we do it at least until the time of Adhan, is that okay? It's now 6:06. 6:07.
14 minutes.
So another, right. Call it 15 minutes. Is that all right? Okay. So if anybody has...
With regards to the remarks you're making about Halaqa and our brothers, especially for Hamas. In the light of recent events, the bomb and everything, we find a lot of Muslims, as you mentioned, very emotional, and they tend to praise the action of killing innocent people. Is this, yes, you mentioned this action, this specific action, driving yourself with TNT, etc., is this in the Sunnah?
So brother's asking a question, the logical question is taking yourself, driving yourself with the bomb and exploding bombs, is this for action for the Sunnah? I do not have knowledge if this is permissible according to Sharia, okay? And the reason why is because the issue is predicated upon the difference between is this issue to be thought of as a type of suicide, or is it concerned as a type of in battle, a Muslim is permitted in jihad to attack the disbelievers, even though it might seem that by attacking the disbelievers it would result in most likelihood, you see what I'm saying, his death. So this is something that the scholars of the Ummah need to give a fatwa with. I'm not aware of any fatwa concerning this subject, either affirming it or negating this. And if any of the brothers have heard something, I would like to hear them share that, so I would know myself. So I can't say, Allah knows best whether this is permissible according to Sharia or not. But the point is that what I want to make the thing which we have to understand is that the situation with Hamas and so forth, yes, I mean obviously the brothers in Hamas have a lot of ideas or beliefs which we might find disagreeable to us, okay? Some of them have positions which are somewhat soft with the Shia in Iran. They look up towards them and so forth. Although it might be political in one sense, it seems to have filtered down also in another sense. They're not Shia, but they are, in other words, they don't see it as a big issue. You see what I'm saying? The issue of Sunni and Shia. Likewise, their knowledge of religion is weak in many respects and many aspects. But the point is, one has to understand is that is there an alternative now for the Muslims there? No. The da'wah of the Salaf is very weak in Palestine, almost non-existent. Okay, and so therefore one does not want to take a stance against them, okay, to such a degree that it is an issue that you are giving victory, or by implication assisting the Jews and the Christians. Okay. At the same time, one should not support anything which is wrong. And for those brothers who have knowledge and who have positions of respect in the Ummah, those like the Sheikhs and so forth, it's a responsibility to give these brothers nasiha as to what is best. Okay, one of these written questions, it says, Assalamu alaikum, alaikum assalam. Communism was devised by the Jews. How was this perceived as a threat to the world order which the Christians and Jews are trying to form? And was the Cold War fought to intimidate the Muslims rather than the followers of communism? And finally, what role do Freemasons play in this? Well, as far as the first two questions, when we're going through talking about events in the world, we shouldn't get bogged down into the details. Okay, the specific details of what occurs is really not important to us, because what we should be concerned with only is just the general trends that we may understand which affect us. But as the specific details of as to how they perceive something, or as some of the questions mentioned, because it enters in sometimes a lot of hypothetical discussion, which really is of no benefit. What is the role of the Freemasons, though? The Freemasons have a very important role. Many of the political leaders in the world are Freemasons, and Freemasonry, as has been written by the scholars of Islam, is, basically a front to support Jewish Zionist aims. And the scholars of the Ummah, in a fatwa by the Muslim World League, delivered maybe in the 70s, declared that any Muslim who becomes a Freemason knowing what Freemasonry is about is an apostate and has left Islam. So the Masons have a very important role in this. Yes?
You mentioned about church preparation. One of the points I was interested in is about business. Did you mention some halal business?
So, halal business is whatever is available in your country. I'm not from this country. I don't know how specifically you would go about setting up a business or something. But whatever, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has permitted you to set up. A clothing store, a food store, a factory. You set up a consulting firm for those brothers who know computer programming, and you hire new students who graduated, and you support that thing. And whatever skills you have for that. So the Muslims need to be dynamic and to use their situation in a ways to set up businesses. What Muslims sometimes think is that the only businesses they can get engaged in is selling Islamic books. No, who says that? We need booksellers, and we also need clothes makers, right? And we also need food producers, and we need farmers, and we need doctors, and we need scientists, and we need, also you need computer programmers and engineers and so forth. Or why can't 5 or 6 Muslim engineers in the United Kingdom set up a construction business to build homes and so forth? And even they sell these homes to the disbelievers. And then the laborers, right, who work, the physical laborers, they hire Muslims to do. What's the harm in that? Or does every single Muslim have to become a book salesman and sell only Islamic books? This is the only type of business we are allowed to do in our religion? Sell books and tapes? Of course not. So the point is that whatever Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala provides means of trade, these are all halal, and there's a specific prohibition in the religion regarding that. Yes, okay, quick question. A good question. Okay, a Sahih hadith says that the Prophet ﷺ said, there are three things which, if they appear no good, will be to a soul who has not believed before them and has done good: the rising of the sun from the west, the appearance of Dajjal, and the appearance of the beast from the earth, Ahmed. However, another Sahih hadith says that Isa will come after the sun has risen from the west and after the Dajjal appears. So who are the people in the hadith say will have to accept Islam, or else? Does it mean that those who perhaps realized Islam was the truth but hadn't taken the Shahada? Or does it mean kuffar who will say, be like munafiqs and will be rejected by Allah? So I think there's some confusion here between some Qadiani ideas and the sequence of the events of the hour of the Day of Judgment. The hadith, I don't know if the hadith saying that three matters, being the rising of the sun from the west, and the appearance of Dajjal, and the appearance of the beast from the earth, from Ahmed. But if that hadith is authentic, what I do know is the hadith mentions that the rising of the sun from the west. And Isa comes before the rising of the sun from the west. Rising of the sun from the west is one of the final signs that occur just before the Day of Judgment. And at that time everybody on the earth will believe, but their faith will not help them had they not believed or done good before that. So there seems to be some confusion. As far as the people, be the people of the earth for Isa. When Isa comes, he will give the people the choice of Islam or the sword. The people of the earth, it doesn't mean the hypocrites or those people who recognize Islam to be the truth but didn't take the Shahada or for one reason. It doesn't mean that. Yes. Right. Yes. No. The hadith refers to that. He's mentioning that the hadith says that the Jews, that a hudna, a cessation of hostilities will occur for the first time between you and the Christians. Okay, Benul Asr, the hadith, which is a term used for the Christians, European Christians. They will come to you to fight an army of disbelievers other than them. So, before the Day of Judgment, when these signs appear, what will happen is that the Christians will be facing an enemy of unbelievers, even though they themselves are unbelievers, and they will be unable to deal with this enemy. So for the first time in history, they will come and they will make a true cessation of hostilities. The implication is that the Christians always fight us. We're always in war with the Christians until this time, which is true. Always somewhere in the Islamic world, throughout history, Muslims are fighting the Christians somewhere in the world. And when this occurs, there will be a cessation of hostilities and we'll fight this common enemy. When we will prevail, the battle will occur, and then when the Muslims prevail, a Christian will raise the cross and say, the cross gave us victory. A Muslim will say, you lied, and will strike him dead with the sword. So this shows that when these things happen,